Hello, horror lovers, welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you are listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. As a fan of paranormal and true crime stories, I was intrigued when I stumbled upon an article about multiple strange deaths at my small-town hospital. However, a few days later, I was far less excited when I had to be hospitalized there for food poisoning. The hospital had tried to keep the deaths quiet, labeling them as accidental. But after the seventh death in less than 2 months, word finally got out. Some doctor or nurse must have leaked the information to the press and police, trying to stop more deaths from happening. The circumstances were disturbing. Every article reported the same details. All the victims had died of heart attacks during the night. Each morning, their bodies were discovered by someone making routine rounds. Those who found the victims were traumatized by what they saw. The dead were frozen in expressions of pure terror. Their eyes were wide open, and their mouths twisted in pain. When the public found out, the hospital claimed they had already launched an internal investigation. But staff said nothing concrete was being done. They were more focused on saving their own reputation than finding a culprit. No suspects were identified, and the mystery continued. The day after these articles came out, my mom rushed me to the hospital because I couldn't stop vomiting. The hospital's welcome was overly warm, almost like they were trying to overcompensate. It felt like everyone on staff had been instructed to reassure patients and make the hospital seem like the safest place on earth. Once I was settled in my hospital bed and given some meds, a doctor confirmed to my mom and me that it was just food poisoning. But then he dropped the bombshell. I'd have to stay in the hospital for at least 3 days. Hearing this, my heart started racing. I thought I'd be in and out, maybe with some meds to take at home. Instead, I was going to spend 3 nights in the same hospital where people had been mysteriously dying for the last 2 months. Noticing my reaction, my mom looked worried. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked. I shook my head. 3 days, is that really necessary? I asked, trying to hide my fear. The doctor smiled. "If you don't want to hurt yourself by passing out in the bathroom, then yes, it's necessary," he said with a chuckle. My mom frowned and asked, "Why are you so worried?" I hesitated before blurting out, "It's just ... with the stories about murders in this hospital." For a brief moment, the doctor's smile faded. He quickly regained his composure, though, "Don't worry, it's just a series of unfortunate accidents," he said awkwardly. "The press has blown the story out of proportion, but I could tell even he didn't believe what he was saying. And besides, we have nurses making rounds every hour, every night." "You're safe," he added. The nurse standing beside him, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Don't worry. I'll be doing the rounds myself every night. You're in good hands." There was something about her calm confidence that put me slightly at ease, even if only for a moment. Meanwhile, my mom was still frowning, clearly confused. The doctor eventually pulled her aside, probably to explain everything in more detail. From my hospital bed, I could see her talking to him through the small window in the door, her hand nervously rubbing her neck as she glanced over at me. Eventually, she nodded, came back into the room, and said, "Everything's going to be fine. We don't really have much of a choice anyway, considering your condition." I dreaded that first night like someone dreads the end of their life, full of anxiety for the unknown. As I lay in bed, I watched the sun slowly dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across my room. I was still feeling weak, but I managed to stay awake, scrolling through my phone, reading article after article. The more I read, the more my fear grew. Some theories were supernatural, stories of a malevolent entity haunting the hospital, feeding off the weakened patients and draining them of their life force, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. The comments section on these posts made things worse. People speculated wildly, claiming it was a ghost or some kind of demon. Some insisted that the hospital was cursed. My nerves were already frayed from the day's events, and this wasn't helping. As I scrolled in a frenzy, trying to distract myself, Eva, the nurse who was in charge of the night rounds, walked into my room. She had a calm presence, almost too calm for the situation we were in. I had to take my medication and try to get some sleep, but fear made that seem impossible. "No offense," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I set my phone on the table, "but none of the nurses have been found dead. I guess that's why you aren't scared." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Look, nobody knows for sure what's been happening here," she admitted, her tone serious. "There have been some strange things going on, yes. But that's why I'm here, doing rounds every hour. Like you said, none of the nurses have been targeted. So, as far as we can tell, you're safe." "Safe from what?" I interrupted. "Or from who?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "The person responsible, if they exist, is probably long gone. But with us being more vigilant, the chances of anything happening again are slim." She tried to reassure me, but her words didn't calm the anxiety twisting in my stomach. After that, she wished me good night and left. I took a deep breath, swallowed my medication, and burrowed under the covers, hoping sleep would come soon. Exhaustion finally won out. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my lingering fear, I drifted off into a deep sleep. I wasn't sure how long I had been out when I woke up suddenly, my eyes fluttering open to the darkened room. The faint light from the hallway spilled in through the crack beneath the door, but everything else was submerged in shadows. I sat up, my heart pounding, trying to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the corner of the room. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end as I stared into the dark corner. It was hard to see, but something about the darkness in that corner felt different. It was almost too dark, unnatural, like a shadow that had weight to it. There was no way I was going to go over there to investigate, like those characters in horror movies who always make the worst decisions. I knew better than that. Instead, I slowly slipped out of bed, my eyes never leaving the corner, and tiptoed toward the door. I was determined to find someone, anyone, to check it out. And then I heard it, a whisper clear as day, but somehow also soft and chilling. "You are next." My blood ran cold. I screamed, bolting for the door, my hands fumbling for the handle. Just as I was about to yank it open, I saw a face looking at me through the small window. It was Eva. Her eyes widened in surprise at my terrified scream. She quickly opened the door and rushed in, flipping on the lights. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" she asked, concern etched across her face. I could barely catch my breath, my entire body shaking. I pointed toward the corner of the room, trying to explain what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come out. Eva looked at me, then glanced at the corner where I had heard the whisper. She crossed the room and stood there for a moment, inspecting the area before turning back to me. "There's nothing here," she said, trying to soothe me. "You're safe." But even as she said it, I wasn't convinced. Someone, had whispered to me. I knew what I had heard. The day had flown by in a blur. My parents had visited, trying their best to keep me in good spirits. We talked about everything except the unsettling events of the night before. My mom fussed over me while my dad offered reassuring words, telling me that soon enough I'd be back home and the hospital stay would be a distant memory. I nodded along, but my mind kept returning to the previous night, the shadow, the whisper, Eva's uneasy expression. Still, as the sun began to set again, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. I'd been weak, dehydrated, and stressed. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe tonight would be different. Over dinner, I spoke with Eva again. She seemed more relaxed now, offering more reassurances that I'd be just fine. We talked about mundane things, movies, music, anything to distract me from the dark thoughts lingering in the back of my mind. As she left with her usual comforting smile, I almost believed everything would be okay. I took my medication, gulped down a large glass of water, and lay back in bed. My eyes grew heavy, and soon I drifted off into what felt like a peaceful, dreamless sleep. But then, I felt it. Two hands pressing down on my legs. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sensation was so real yet so foreign. One hand moved slowly up my thigh, followed by the other, as if someone was deliberately trying to feel every inch of me. Panic shot through my body, and I bolted upright, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing, just the oppressive darkness that seemed to engulf everything. But when I looked down, I saw it, the unmistakable imprint of two massive hands on the blanket, pressing into me. The weight was real, even though there was no one there. I gasped, the air catching in my throat. I felt paralyzed with fear. I screamed, my voice echoing through the room like the cry of a wounded animal. As I screamed, the hands moved up to my chest. I could feel them, pushing down with the force of something invisible yet overwhelmingly powerful. My mind raced with every terrible possibility. Would they crush my heart? Would they wrap around my throat and suffocate me slowly? Or would they simply hold me there, draining the life out of me, inch by inch, until I was nothing but a lifeless shell? Just as the panic reached its peak, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The room flooded with light. Eva was standing there, breathless and drenched in sweat, her eyes wide as she scanned the room. You saw it? I stammered, my voice trembling, barely able to get the words out. Her face was pale, her eyes as wide as mine had been. Yes. Yes, I saw it. Her voice was shaky, and she looked as horrified as I felt. We both stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do, as if whatever had been in the room had suddenly vanished the moment the lights came on. But the imprint of those hands lingered on my blanket, the pressure on my chest still palpable. Then it hit me. My head began to spin violently, as if someone had pulled the ground out from under me. My vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as my heart raced uncontrollably in my chest. I could hear its erratic beats thundering in my ears, each one louder than the last. My knees buckled, and I collapsed back onto the bed. Eva rushed over to me, but I could barely see her. My breathing grew shallow, and I fought to stay conscious. Through the overwhelming dizziness, I heard it again, that whisper. Stay awake, it said, barely audible, but distinct enough to send chills down my spine. I tried to fight it, tried to hold on to whatever consciousness I had left. But it was no use. The world around me went dark, and I fainted, the echo of that sinister whisper following me into the blackness. When I woke up, it felt like I was resurfacing from a deep, dark abyss. The room was bathed in an unsettling afternoon light, but everything around me was a blur. My body felt weak, my thoughts sluggish, as if I were trapped in a fog. A doctor was speaking softly to my mother, who looked as pale as a ghost, her face etched with worrying doubt. As soon as my eyes fluttered open, she rushed over to me. "Don't worry, darling. Everything will be fine," she whispered, stroking my forehead. "Just sleep and rest." Before I could mumble a response, a nurse leaned over, injecting something into the tube attached to me. I squinted up at her. It was Eva. Her familiar smile was there, but something was off. There was a subtle shift in her expression, a gleam in her eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to hold on to the thought, but my body betrayed me. My eyelids grew heavy, and once again I was pulled into sleep. I drifted in a void, completely numb, as though invisible straps held me down, keeping me suspended between the waking world and whatever strange reality this hospital had dragged me into. I couldn't move, couldn't think, but I felt something. Something was there, lurking, hovering just beyond the edge of consciousness. Then a voice. "Wake up." It was a whisper, soft but insistent. I tried to respond, to obey, but I was so weak. My mind felt like it was floating somewhere far away from my body. "Wake up," it urged again, louder this time. I could feel a presence. Something unnatural, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. It pressed in on me, and despite my numbness, the fear surged through me. And then, more voices joined in, each one growing more desperate than the last. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." The chorus of voices became overwhelming, as if every spirit in that hospital was screaming at me, trying to drag me back from the brink. Suddenly, I gasped, my eyes snapping open, my chest heaving as I gulped for air. What I saw before me wasn't a nightmare. It was worse. Eva. She was looming over me, her knees pressed into the bed, a syringe poised in her hand. But her expression wasn't the comforting smile I had grown accustomed to. No, her face was twisted in a sickening mix of ecstasy and malice. Her lips curled in pleasure as she held my jaw with one hand, tilting my head to expose my neck. I stared at her, horrified, trying to process what was happening. This was no hallucination. No ghostly entity was controlling her. This was her true face, the face of a cold-blooded killer. My body felt like lead. I could barely move, barely breathe, as she leaned in closer, the needle glistening ominously in the dim light. I tried to lift my arms, but they felt like dead weight. Was this really it? Was I going to die here, at the hands of the one person who was supposed to protect me? Just as she was about to plunge the needle into my neck, she froze, her eyes widening in shock. She stared at something over my shoulder, her face contorting from ecstasy to sheer terror. And then, in an instant, fury replaced the fear. "This time you won't be able to stop me," she screeched, her voice hysterical. That brief moment of hesitation gave me the time I desperately needed. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I twisted my body violently, knocking us both off the bed. We tumbled onto the cold floor, and suddenly, it was as if I were grappling with a wild animal. Eva was screaming like a banshee, thrashing wildly as she tried to force the needle into me. Her strength was terrifying, unnatural, but somehow I managed to keep her arm pinned. Her face was a twisted mask of rage and madness, and her words slurred into an incoherent mess of threats and fury. For what felt like an eternity, but could have been no more than a few seconds, we struggled on the floor. The needle gleamed dangerously as I fought to keep it away from my skin. She howled, her eyes blazing with hatred, but I wasn't going to give up. Not like this. Just as I felt my grip beginning to falter, the door to my room burst open. A doctor and another nurse rushed in, quickly restraining Eva as she let out a final, blood-curdling scream. They dragged her off me, her limbs flailing wildly, her voice now a distorted screech of madness as they pinned her to the ground. I crawled backward, my back hitting the wall as I gasped for breath, shaking uncontrollably. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stared in disbelief as they subdued her, injecting her with something that finally caused her to fall limp. The nightmare wasn't over, but I had survived. I was alive, as I leaned against the wall, catching my breath. I couldn't shake the thought that haunted me. How many others had Eva killed in this hospital? How many nights had she stood over someone, syringe in hand, with that same twisted smile? An hour after our struggle, the police arrived and took Eva away, still eerily silent but with that manic edge lingering in her eyes. It felt surreal watching her being led down the hall, her hands cuffed in front of her. Eva had been more unstable than anyone could have imagined. During her interrogation, it didn't take long for her to break. The police said she confessed to multiple murders, each one committed with chilling precision. Her weapon of choice was an undetectable substance that induced cardiac arrest, making it seem like her victims had simply passed away due to their fragile health. I could only imagine the horror of the other families, those who had lost loved ones to her twisted plans, thinking it was fate when in reality it had been murder all along. As for me, I wasn't completely out of danger. The toll of the past few days, the fear, the attacks, had worsened my condition. My heart had taken a beating both physically and emotionally, so I was kept in the hospital for another week, this time under the care of doctors and nurses I knew I could trust. No more shadows creeping in the corners, no more cold hands pressing down on my body. Just the quiet monotony of a hospital stay. Each night I would lie awake, replaying the events over and over. It was impossible to truly comprehend how close I had come to being one of Eva's victims. That thought alone kept me up many nights, my mind racing with what-ifs. What if I hadn't woken up in time? What if she had been faster with that syringe? The thin thread that had kept me alive was almost too fragile to believe, but eventually life returned to some semblance of normal. There were no more strange occurrences, no whispers from the darkness. It was as if the sinister energy that had surrounded the hospital died the moment Eva was taken away. The tension that had gripped me so tightly finally began to ease. On my last day, I felt an odd sense of peace as I packed up my things, preparing to finally leave this place that had been both a nightmare and, in the end, my salvation. I zipped up my bag and glanced around the room one last time. That's when I heard it. Faint, barely audible, like the softest breath of wind brushing past my ear. Whispers. They seemed to rise from somewhere deep in the room, a collective murmur like the voices I'd heard before, those that had told me to wake up. They were quieter now, softer, but still unmistakable. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but this time there was no fear, no dread. It felt different. It wasn't a warning or a threat. It was almost comforting. Without thinking, I turned to the empty room, my voice coming out in a quiet, instinctive whisper, "Thank you." And with that, I left the hospital, stepping into the daylight, leaving behind the whispers, the shadows, and the horrors that had nearly claimed my life, but I would never forget. It has been 3 weeks since the wagon train left St. Louis for the Colorado Territory, and many more since I pulled Sarah and little Timothy from our home in Pennsylvania. There was no work left in the East, So when I saw the advertisement for Bridge Brothers Mining Company, I knew this was our only chance. I know nothing about mining, but a man has to feed his family somehow. And so here we are, on the trail west. Sarah, bless her, was not thrilled, but she supported my decision. I know this journey is hard on her, especially with Timothy, just 2 years old, but I am doing this for them. If I can make a good wage, perhaps we can finally settle somewhere proper. The wagon train has been mostly uneventful so far, thank God. There are about 5 single men and a dozen families traveling with us. My old friend Henry is among them, though I suspect his decision to come was more about heartbreak than opportunity. Charlotte refused his engagement back home, and I think he's trying to outrun his feelings. Another friend, Horace, and his wife Eliza, decided to join us too. I have no idea how Horace convinced her to come along with their 2 young children. I've spent every penny of Pa's inheritance on supplies and sent ahead for a small homestead to be built for us near the mine. It's a risk, but I hope the house will be ready by the time we arrive. I've never run a homestead before. In fact, I've never worked the land or the mines, and the thought of it is daunting. But what choice do I have? There's no future for us in the city. The air here feels different, cleaner, wilder. I try to think that once we reach Colorado, everything will fall into place. Maybe I'm a fool for thinking that, but I have to believe it for Sarah and Timothy's sake. May 29th, 1870, for we're nearing the end of this journey now. Only a day or 2 away from the mining settlement. It's strange to think how far we've come. The Bridge Brothers Company bought this mine from another outfit that ran out of money before they could properly develop the land. That means there's already a town of sorts waiting for us, with a few amenities that will make life easier. We'll be staying in the boarding house until our homestead is ready. It won't be much, but after weeks on the wagon, even the hardest bed will feel like a luxury. Sarah has spent most of the trip in the back with Tim, shielding him from the brutal sun. I've been up front, driving the wagon with only our dog, Scout, for company. The days were long, and the heat relentless. Without Scout, I think I might have gone mad before we crossed into Kansas. Now, in Colorado, the land feels different. It's older, wilder, more untouched than anything I've ever seen. There's a weight in the air, a sense of history that the ground itself carries. The vastness of it, the untouched wilderness, it humbles a man. It feels wrong, almost, for us to carve out our little lives here. The land doesn't belong to us. We're intruders, trying to wrestle with something far bigger and older than we could ever hope to understand. I grew up in the city, in Philadelphia, and this vast, untamed landscape seems like another world. The things we've seen out here, the wild horses, the endless plains, the jagged mountains on the horizon, they belong to a different reality than the one I knew back east. But I suppose soon enough, we'll try to make this place ours. May 30th, 1870, for my mother died when I was 11 from cholera. After she passed, my father poured himself into his work. He always said he was doing it to give me a better life, to send me to school so I wouldn't have to struggle like he did. I took his sacrifice to heart, studying writing and literature. Not exactly the most profitable choice, I'll admit. I can't help but wonder what my father would think if he saw me now, working in the mines just to keep my family fed. He never got the chance to see me graduate. 2 men robbed his store, and in the struggle, his heart gave out. I was in my 2nd year of university when I got the news. After I graduated, I worked briefly for a small newspaper, but the editor's nephew needed a job, and I was let go. Since then, I've drifted from job to job, odd errands mostly for my father's old business associates. Nothing stable. Then I met Sarah. Her father didn't approve, but we married anyway, and before long, Timothy was on the way. That's when the pressure really started. I needed steady work, but it just wasn't coming. When the opportunity to work for Bridge Brothers Mining Company came up, I jumped at the chance, knowing full well that I knew nothing about mining. But at least it was something. It's almost time for my night watch with Henry. There's something unnerving about the wilderness at night. The only light comes from the moon and the campfire, and it casts shadows that play tricks on your eyes. You start imagining shapes lurking in the trees. Thank God for Scout, though. He's kept me sane on these nights. A few days back, I mistook a stick for a rattlesnake. Before I could make a fool of myself and wake the whole camp, Scout trotted over with the stick in his mouth, wagging his tail, ready to play. June 2nd, 1870. For we arrived at the mining settlement yesterday. It was a relief to see actual buildings after weeks on the trail. The crew sent ahead by Bridge Brothers was there to greet us. They had prepared the boarding house, which is where Sarah, Timothy, and I are staying for now. It isn't exactly comfortable, but after weeks of sleeping on the ground, it feels like a luxury. They even had a tub, which was much needed after the dust and sweat of the journey. My first day in the mine was uneventful. The more experienced men showed us around, gave us a rundown of the camp, and evaluated our skills. As expected, I was assigned to haul rubble from the tunnel while they dug deeper. I can't say I'm disappointed. I'd rather not be the one responsible for collapsing a tunnel on the first day. The tunnel doesn't go in very far, only about 300 feet. The company before Bridge Brothers ran out of money and never got a proper operation going. Apparently, this area has been mined for gold in the past, but it wasn't rich enough to sustain the effort. Silver, however, seems to be in better supply. The town itself is small but cozy, nestled in a mountain valley surrounded by dense forest. There's a general store, a saloon, a Dr. Barber, and a church. It's modest, but after the bustle of Philadelphia, the quiet is a welcome change. I received word that our homestead should be finished by the end of the month. For now, the boarding house will do, but I think we'll all feel better once we have our own space to stretch out. July 2nd, 1874. We moved into our new home last week. It's not much, but it's ours. We've got a few sheep, a cow, and the horses from the wagon. Sarah has been taking care of Timothy and getting the house in order, while I've been chopping firewood and clearing the land. She and Tim went to church last Sunday, but I stayed behind. Church and I haven't been on good terms for some time. After my mother passed, my father stopped going, and so did I, and when my father died, any faith I had left with him. While I was out in the yard, an old man wandered across the property. His name was Byron, a prospector from the gold rush days. He said he used to pass through here on his way to town before it became a homestead. I told him he was welcome to keep walking through as long as he didn't cause any trouble. We chatted for a while, and when I mentioned the mine, something changed in him. His face went stiff, and his voice grew low and serious. "Mind where you dig," he said. I laughed it off, but he didn't. He left abruptly after that, without another word. July 13th, 1870. For something strange happened in the mine today. We were making good progress on the tunnel when Silas's pickaxe hit something unusual. Instead of the usual clang of metal on stone, his pick sank into a soft, clay-like substance. When he pulled it back, a chunk of the wall crumbled away, revealing a small tunnel hidden behind it. The opening was about 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, and it looked like no natural formation we'd ever seen. Horace and Silas cleared the remaining clay, and sure enough, we had discovered a passage of some sort. None of us could figure out what could have made a tunnel like that. There are no animals big enough to burrow like this, at least none that we know of. I couldn't help but think of Byron's cryptic warning. "Mind where you dig." His words rang in my head as I stared into that dark, narrow opening. It gave me a bad feeling. July 18th, 1874, we went into town today for supplies and to catch up with friends. I was talking with Henry and Horace when we heard a ruckus coming from the saloon. Curious, we walked in and found Silas, surrounded by a group of men, angrily recounting how several of his sheep and a goat had vanished overnight. According to him, the animals were safely penned in, and the gate was still closed in the morning. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just gone. Silas started blaming the disappearances on the natives, though he used a much less civil term to describe them. I've always been taught to treat people fairly, regardless of who they are, so hearing him talk like that didn't sit well with me. But one thing struck me as odd. We hadn't seen any signs of native tribes since we arrived, not even in passing. That didn't line up with the stories I'd always heard about the West. It seemed they were everywhere in the frontier, yet here, there was no sign of them. That night, I made sure to double and triple check that our livestock was secure. Whatever took Silas's animals was still out there, and I wasn't taking any chances. July 20th, 1874, things are getting stranger. Silas didn't show up at the mine today. Usually, the only excuse for missing work is being too sick to stand, because no work means no pay. They were convinced it was whatever had taken Silas's animals, likely wolves or a mountain lion. A few of the men warned me to keep a gun nearby in case the animals came for my livestock next. There's just one problem. I don't own a gun. I was never one for violence, so I never felt the need. But now, with everything happening, I've decided to order one from the general store as soon as I get paid. For now, I'll have to make do with what I've got. July 22nd, 1874, they found Silas. He didn't show up to the mine again today, so a few of the other miners rode out to his homestead in a wagon to check on him. When they returned, their faces were pale, and they were quiet, too quiet. In the back of the wagon lay Silas, his wife, and their 2 children, dead. But it wasn't just death that took them. Whatever killed them had drained every drop of blood from their bodies. Their skin was shriveled and taut, like old fruit left too long in the sun. And their faces, God, their faces, frozen in wide-eyed terror, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The men gathered around the wagon, muttering, trying to make sense of it. A few suggested it might have been wolves, but no one believed that. No animal could do this. As I stood there, staring at the lifeless bodies, I caught sight of Byron standing off in the distance. He wasn't looking at the bodies, though. He was looking at us, his expression grim, but not surprised. In fact, he looked more disappointed than anything else, as if he had seen this before. As I turned to look back at the wagon, my skin prickled. When I looked back toward Byron, he was gone. I need to find him. He knows something, and I intend to find out what it is. July 23rd, 1870, for I woke this morning to the sound of Scout barking frantically and Sarah screaming. I rushed to the front door, and the sight that awaited me made my blood run cold. Lying there, twisted and mangled, was the corpse of old Byron. His body looked as though it had been drained, just like Silas and his family. I suppose I'll never get the chance to ask him what he knew about these strange happenings. But now, the terror was right at our doorstep. Whatever did that to Byron had come too close for comfort, and I knew deep down it would return. Sarah was in no shape to attend church today, though she probably needed it more than ever. Realizing that I was unarmed, I made my way to Henry's place and asked him for a rifle. He kindly lent me one, along with enough ammunition to defend my family from whatever lurked out there. Tonight, I'll sit on the porch with Scout, keeping watch. I pray we don't have another visitor like Byron. July 24th, 1870, for last night was worse than anything I could have imagined. For the first few hours, the night was quiet. Too quiet. Then, without warning, Scout stiffened, growling low and deep, his hackles raised. That's when I saw them. 5 creatures. There's no better word for it. They were pale as moonlight, creeping low to the ground on four crooked limbs. Their bodies were hairless, their faces featureless except for gaping mouths full of needle-like teeth. The most horrifying thing about them was the lack of eyes, just smooth, blank skin where I should have been. I raised the rifle, backing slowly toward the door, trying not to make any sudden movements. Scout barked fiercely but didn't charge at them. He knew better. My hands fumbled as I found the latch and fell backward into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. Sarah must have heard the commotion, and she rushed to help me. As I caught my breath, I realized with horror that Scout was still outside, barking desperately. Sarah hadn't seen the creatures, and she didn't realize the danger our poor dog was in. I scrambled to open the door, but it was too late. Scout's barking stopped abruptly, and what followed was a sound I will never forget, a sickening thud against the door. I couldn't bring myself to open it, knowing what I'd find on the other side. July 25th, 1870, for I opened the door this morning, and my worst fears were confirmed. Scout's lifeless body lay against the house, drained of every drop of blood. He had been a loyal companion, and now I had failed him. I spent the morning burying him beneath his favorite tree. It felt like the least I could do for such a faithful friend. The rest of the day, Sarah and I focused on fortifying the house. We brought in all the supplies, boarded up the windows, and reinforced the front door. I knew those creatures would come again tonight. I couldn't get the image of Scout's broken body out of my mind, nor the lifeless faces of Silas and his family. As I worked, Byron's warning echoed in my head again. Mind where you dig. I wish I had paid more attention to his words before all this began. July 26, 1870, for they came back. Just after sunset, the creatures returned, banging and scratching at the door and windows. Sarah took Tim back to the bedroom, thinking they'd be safer there. But in my panic, I had forgotten Tim's crib was under the window. I realized the mistake too late. Just as Sarah went to lay Tim down, the window shattered. One of the creatures forced its way through, its clawed hand latching onto Sarah's shoulder. I tried to run to her, but in the blink of an eye, she and Tim were gone. Taken by those monsters, I collapsed, my mind reeling. How could this happen? What had we done to deserve such a fate? I was just a simple man, living a simple life, and now my family was gone, stolen by the very things I couldn't understand. There are still a few hours before daylight, and I know those creatures are still out there, waiting. I have nothing left to lose. If I am to die, I'll face them head-on. I've removed the barricades from the front door. When the time comes, I'll charge outside and fire every bullet I have. Maybe I can take one of them with me. I was warned to mind where I dug, but I didn't listen. Now, It's too late. Postscript: the Bridge Brothers' mine described in Joseph Whalen's journal was abandoned shortly after the events he recounted. The mine was sealed, and it is unknown if any miners survived or simply left the area. The land remained untouched for nearly a century, until the journal was discovered. No one knows for certain what happened to Joseph Whalen, his family, or the other miners. The journal stands as a haunting reminder of the dangers that lie beneath the earth and the creatures that might be disturbed when we dig too deep. Perhaps it's best we never know what lurks in the dark corners of our world. And as Byron's words echo through time, let them serve as a warning to us all. Mind where you dig. Bobby shrugged, looking a bit anxious. Nope. Just going to wait and see. Pilar grinned, his excitement almost palpable. It's going to happen, just like last night. We'll all wake up right before it hits 3. I felt a knot in my stomach. Part of me wanted to laugh at Pilar's wild imagination, but another part of me, one that had been wearing thin since the accident, yearned to believe him. I settled into the corner of the couch, pulling the blanket over my legs. The night stretched on, and the sounds of the outside world faded into a dull hush. The dim light from the TV flickered across the room as we played another round of a mindless racing game. It was comforting, if only for a moment, to lose myself in something so trivial. But as I glanced at the clock, time seemed to drag. Pilar's enthusiasm was infectious, but I couldn't shake the nagging worrying that this was just another one of his stories, a distraction from the void we were all trying to fill. What if it doesn't happen? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It will, he insisted, confidence shining in his eyes. Trust me. As the minutes ticked by, a heaviness settled in the room, wrapping around us like a thick fog. Bobby had drifted off, his head resting awkwardly on his arms, but Pilar and I remained wide awake. I stole glances at the clock, my heart racing with each passing minute. Then, without warning, the digital clock blinked to 58 a.m. Pilar leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Get ready," he whispered. I felt a chill wash over me as the time ticked forward. I glanced over at Bobby, still sound asleep. What if this was all a bad idea? What if we were waking something best left buried? To 59 a.m. My heart pounded in my chest as I focused on the seconds, each one feeling heavier than the last. The silence enveloped us, broken only by the faint hum of the TV. I wanted to close my eyes, to pull the blanket over my head and ignore whatever might happen next. But I stayed alert, caught between hope and fear. As the clock flipped to 3 a.m., the air grew thick with tension. I exchanged a glance with Pilar, whose eyes were wide with anticipation, his breath quickening. Then it happened. A sound echoed from outside, a low, mournful howl that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the night. I froze, my heart racing as the noise deepened, transforming into a series of guttural growls. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Pilar's expression shifted from excitement to confusion. "I don't know. Maybe it's just an animal." But we both knew it wasn't. The sound carried a weight that made my insides churn. We sat in stunned silence, the moment stretching as we waited for something to happen. Just then, a flicker of movement caught my eye outside the window. I leaned closer, peering through the grime-covered glass. The streetlight illuminated the road ahead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. That's when I saw them. Two figures emerged from the darkness, walking toward Pilar's house. My breath caught in my throat. They were moving slowly, deliberately, and though I couldn't see their faces clearly, I recognized the way they carried themselves. My heart raced as I turned to Pilar, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you see that?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "It can't be. No, it's not possible." But it was. The figures were our fathers. I couldn't believe it. My heart soared and sank at once. Was this some kind of cruel trick, a manifestation of our grief? I wanted to believe it was real, but fear clawed at my chest, threatening to suffocate me. The men approached, their outlines becoming clearer with each step. I could see their familiar silhouettes, the way they moved, the shapes of their clothes, but their faces were obscured in shadow. Suddenly, the door rattled. A shiver ran through me as I looked back at Pilar, whose face was a mask of disbelief. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. I don't know," I stammered. Panic coursed through me, a frantic urge to run flooding my mind. But my feet felt glued to the floor, as if some invisible force was holding me in place. Before I could decide, the door burst open, swinging wide on its hinges. In the dim light of the living room, the figures stepped inside. I could see them clearly now, their faces illuminated in a flash of light from the TV. But what I saw sent my heart crashing into despair. These weren't our fathers. Their faces were twisted, grotesque, and recognizable. The warm familiarity of our dads was replaced with an emptiness that filled me with dread. The creatures that stood before us wore the shadows of our memories, but they weren't alive. They had returned, not as protectors or guides, but as manifestations of our grief, representatives of the loss we could never escape. "What do you want?" I cried out, the words spilling from my lips, but I knew deep down there would be no answer. They moved closer, their hollow eyes boring into me, and I felt a rush of terror like I had never known. "Run!" Pilar shouted, his voice breaking the spell. He grabbed Bobby, who was still half asleep, and pulled him toward the door. I didn't need any more urging. I followed suit, racing down the hall and bursting out into the night. The air was cold against my skin as we stumbled into the street, our breaths coming in frantic gasps. Behind us, I could hear the low growls rising again, echoing in the night as the figures lingered at the edge of the house. "We have to get to the park." Bobby yelled, his face pale with fear. We took off down Ferry Street, our bikes forgotten, hearts pounding as we ran. The weight of loss threatened to drag us down, but we pushed forward, desperate to escape whatever dark force had invaded our lives once more. As we reached the park, we collapsed on the grass, panting and shaking. The shadows of the trees loomed around us, but it felt safer than the chaos we had left behind. What the hell was that? Bobby gasped, eyes wide. Pilar shook his head, his earlier bravado gone. "I don't know, but we need to tell someone. We can't keep this to ourselves," I nodded, though I could hardly process what had happened. The world felt unsteady beneath me, as if the very ground might open up and swallow me whole. We sat in silence, the night stretching on, each of us grappling with the weight of what we had seen. The memories of our fathers haunted us, and the loss that had once felt distant now loomed larger than life. We had run from the darkness, but deep down, we knew it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting for us to return. I staggered back into the living room, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a trapped animal. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me in waves, leaving me breathless. "Bobby," I called out, my voice shaking. But the only reply was the echo of my own fear. Pilar was still on the floor, staring at the open door with wide, horror-stricken eyes. "What just happened?" he whispered, as if afraid to give voice to our worst fears. I felt sick. We shouldn't have opened the door. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The memory of Bobby's desperate sprint haunted me. He had run towards something that wasn't real, something that had stolen our fathers and twisted their memories into something dark and malevolent. The silence pressed down on us, heavy and suffocating. "We have to find him," Pilar said suddenly, scrambling to his feet. "He couldn't have gone far. He wouldn't just leave us." But deep down, I feared he might have. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the numbness that clung to me. Bobby was scared. He might have gone looking for us. For his dad. Pilar moved toward the door, but I caught his arm. "No, wait. What if that thing is still out there?" Pilar's face twisted in frustration. "We can't just sit here. We have to help him." "Help him how?" I shot back. "What can we do? We don't even know what we're up against." He pulled away, the panic in his eyes turning to anger. "We can't leave him out there alone. You saw him. You heard him. He needs us." A part of me knew he was right, but fear held me back like a vice. I glanced outside again, the street shrouded in shadows, as if waiting for the darkness to consume us too. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier now. "But we stick together. No more running off." Pilar nodded, determination flaring in his eyes. "Fine. We'll look for him. Together." We stepped outside, the chill of the night biting at our skin. The street was eerily quiet, devoid of the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if we were walking into a trap. "Bobby," I called out, my voice echoing into the darkness. The emptiness that met my call was unsettling. "Bobby, where are you?" I strained to listen, hoping to hear a reply, but only the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic greeted us. Pilar moved down the walkway, glancing back to make sure I was still with him. "We should check the park," he said, glancing nervously around. "That's where he always goes when he needs to think." Nodding, I followed him, our footsteps muffled by the thick grass. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced up at the sky, searching for some sign, some comfort in the familiar stars, but they felt distant, indifferent to our plight. "Bobby," I shouted again, desperation creeping into my voice. The park lay shrouded in shadow, the trees looming like silent sentinels. "Where are you?" As we ventured deeper into the park, the oppressive silence wrapped around us. I kept expecting to see Bobby's figure emerge from the darkness, but he remained elusive. Every rustle of leaves sent chills down my spine, the fear of what lurked in the night gnawing at my insides. "Do you think he really saw our dads?" Pilar asked, breaking the silence. I hesitated, recalling the way Bobby had scrambled for the door, his face lit with hope. "I don't know. It felt too real, too wrong." Pilar frowned, the weight of the night pressing down on us. "But if he did, then he must be looking for them. We can't let him face that alone." A sudden thought struck me, chilling my blood. What if whatever took them, it wants us to? Pilar's eyes widened, fear washing over his features. "Don't say that." We pressed onward, determination mingling with dread, the hope of finding Bobby fading with each step. Just as we approached the old swing set, I heard a faint noise, a whisper carried on the wind. "Bobby," I called, my voice trembling. The sound grew louder, a mix of laughter and something else, something darker. I stepped closer to the swings, my heart racing. "Bobby, are you there?" And then I saw him, sitting on the ground, hunched over, his back to us. Relief washed over me, but as I approached, my heart dropped. "Bobby," I asked again, fear tightening my throat. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond. The laughter grew louder, echoing eerily in the darkness. "Bobby." I shouted, panic surging within me. Pilar rushed forward, and as we reached him, I froze. Bobby was staring blankly at the ground, his expression vacant, as if he were in a trance. Bobby, I shook him gently, but he didn't react. The laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I glanced around, feeling a chill run down my spine. What's happening? Just then, Bobby lifted his head, his eyes wide and unfocused. I saw them, he whispered, voice trembling. They were here. They wanted me to come. Come where? I demanded, fear coursing through me. Bobby, what do you mean? He blinked slowly, confusion washing over his face. They wanted to show me something. I exchanged a worried glance with Pilar. Show you what? I don't know, Bobby said, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog. But they're waiting. Who's waiting? I pressed, my voice rising with desperation. Bobby stood up slowly, still dazed. Our dads, he said, a mixture of hope and fear in his voice. They're waiting for us to come home. No, I shouted, taking a step back. We can't. We can't go back to that house. But before I could react, Bobby turned and began walking toward the woods that bordered the park. Bobby, wait, Pilar cried, lunging to grab him. But Bobby shrugged him off. The shadows seemed to swallow him as he moved deeper into the trees, an unseen force pulling him toward the darkness. Bobby, please. I shouted, but he didn't stop. Pilar and I exchanged terrified glances, then bolted after him, our hearts racing as we plunged into the shadows. Bobby, I yelled, my voice cracking. The laughter returned, echoing through the trees, filling the air with a chilling resonance. The darkness felt alive, pressing in around us as we chased after our friend, desperate to bring him back. The night twisted and turned, the path ahead becoming obscured by shadows, as if the woods themselves were conspiring against us. We fought to keep Bobby in sight, but he was slipping away, lost in the depths of the dark. Stop, Pilar shouted, grabbing my arm as I stumbled. We can't lose him, I know, I cried, panic rising within me. But what if suddenly the laughter faded, replaced by a soft voice that drifted through the trees like a whisper? Come home, boys. The sound sent chills down my spine. I hesitated, the darkness clawing at my resolve. What if it's a trap? I said, fear creeping into my voice. We have to find him. Pilar insisted, pulling me forward. We can't let him go alone. Just as we were about to push deeper into the woods, a piercing scream shattered the silence. Bobby's voice echoed through the trees, filled with terror. No, stop, don't, Pilar, and I exchanged horrified glances. That came from over there. I pointed in the direction of the sound, and we took off, fear lending us speed dart as we burst through the underbrush. We found ourselves in a clearing, and what we saw stopped us in our tracks. Bobby was standing there, his back to us, facing a swirling mass of shadows that coiled and writhed like smoke. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that echoed through the air. Welcome back, it said, the words slithering through the darkness. You've been expected, Bobby, I shouted, fear and anger coursing through me. Get away from it. But he didn't move. He stood there, entranced, as if the shadows were calling to him. What do we do? Pilar whispered, trembling beside me. We have to pull him away. I said, but the shadows shifted, a wall of darkness rising to block our path. Stay away. The voice warned, deep and rumbling like thunder. He belongs to us now. Now. I screamed, panic surging. Bobby, come on. You're stronger than this. But my words fell flat against the swirling mass. Bobby turned slowly, his eyes glazed over, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the shadows. "Bobby, fight it." I yelled, pushing against the darkness. "You can't let it take you." But he was slipping away, the shadows wrapping around him like tendrils, drawing him closer. "No," I shouted, lunging forward. But the darkness pushed me back. A force I couldn't fight. Pilar was beside me, panic in his eyes. "What do we do?" "I don't know," I yelled, fear choking me. Just then, I remembered the stories we had shared, the tales of light overcoming darkness. "We have to fight back," I shouted, desperation fueling my resolve. "Fight back how?" Pilar asked, his voice trembling. "Remember the stories. We have to create our own light." Pilar echoed, confusion flashing across his face. "Yes. We need to believe," I yelled, drawing in a deep breath. "Bobby, you can do this. You have to fight." Bobby's eyes flickered, a moment of clarity piercing through the fog. I can't," he cried, struggling against the shadows. "Yes, you can," I shouted, my heart racing. "We're right here with you. You're not alone." For a moment the darkness hesitated, and I seized the opportunity. "Pilar, hold on to me," I said, grasping his arm tightly. We stood together, our resolve forming a fragile shield against the encroaching shadows. "We believe in you, Bobby," I shouted. "You are stronger than this." The shadows writhed and recoiled, and Bobby's face flickered with recognition. I want to go home," he shouted, his voice rising above the darkness. "Then come back to us," I urged, feeling the pull of the shadows weaken. Bobby took a step forward, his expression shifting from fear to determination. "I won't let you take me," he cried, and the shadows shrieked in rage, a cacophony of sound that rattled the trees. The air shimmered, and with a burst of energy, the shadows began to dissipate, retreating into the night. I felt the grip on my heart loosen as Bobby took another step, breaking free from the darkness that had threatened to consume him. "Come on, Bobby. You can do it," Pilar shouted, tears streaming down his face. Bobby's eyes cleared, and he broke into a run, sprinting toward us. We opened our arms wide, ready to embrace him as he burst through the last remnants of darkness. We collided in a tangle of limbs, relief flooding over us. "I thought I lost you," I gasped, holding him tightly. "I was scared," Bobby admitted, trembling. "I didn't know how to fight it." "You did it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You fought back." As we stood there, clinging to one another, the shadows retreated into the trees, hissing in frustration. The laughter faded into the night, leaving behind an eerie silence. "Are you okay?" Pilar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bobby nodded, but I could see the fear lingering in his eyes. "What was that thing?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're not going to let it take us. Not now. Not ever." We started to move away from the clearing, the weight of the night still heavy on our shoulders. "We need to get back to the house," I said, glancing back at the trees. "Together." Pilar nodded, taking Bobby's hand as we began to retrace our steps. As we made our way through the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching us, waiting for the moment to strike again. But we were stronger now, bound together by our shared experience. The bond of friendship, forged in the face of darkness, would carry us through whatever came next. And as we stepped back into the park, I felt a flicker of hope, a light that would guide us home. But deep down, I knew we were only beginning to understand the darkness that lay beyond the edges of our world. Whatever had taken our fathers and drawn us into this nightmare was still out there, lurking, waiting for its next chance. And we would have to be ready. I leaned against the door, my heart racing as I struggled to process Pilar's words. The night felt like it was closing in around me, every shadow whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I could hear the urgency in his voice, but it was laced with something darker, something that made me hesitate. "Pilar, I don't think this is real," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside me. "Whatever you think you saw, it's not him. It's not our dad's. It's something else." His response was almost a snarl. "You don't know that. You didn't see what I saw. You didn't hear him. He's waiting for us." "Waiting for what?" I shot back. "To take us to. Do you really think whatever that thing is will bring Bobby back? Or our dads? It just wants to trap us like it did them." Silence hung heavy between us, the only sound the quiet thumping of my heart. I thought about everything we had faced the night before, the shadows, the laughter, the way Bobby had looked as he stepped into that void. I couldn't let myself believe there was any way out of this. "Come on, man." Pilar's voice broke through the silence, desperation dripping from every word. "If you don't open this door, you'll regret it. I'm not leaving without you." His words struck a nerve. Regret. The last thing I wanted was to feel that again. I had already lost so much, and I wasn't sure I could bear losing more. I closed my eyes, picturing Bobby's face, his laugh, his friendship. But then I saw him standing there, lost in the darkness, just as I had seen him last night. "Just open the door." Pilar shouted again, his frustration boiling over. "You don't want to be alone. You can't just sit in here and wait for it to come for you." I felt a surge of anger. "And what if it comes for you too? You really think you can take that thing on with a bat and some rope? You'll just end up like Bobby." The moment those words left my mouth, I regretted them. Pilar paused, the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "Don't say that," he whispered, and I could hear the trembling in his voice. "I don't want to lose you two," I said, my voice breaking. Pilar's frustration shifted to something deeper, something more profound. "We can't just give up. Don't you want to see them? Don't you want to know what happened? We owe it to them to try." "But what if it's not them? What if it's a trap?" I pleaded, fear and sorrow warring inside me. "Then we'll figure it out together," he insisted. "I can't do this without you. Please." His words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken bond that tied us together. I pressed my forehead against the door, my breath hitching. The thought of seeing my dad again, even for a moment, twisted in my gut. But the thought of facing whatever was out there made my skin crawl. "Open the door," Pilar said again, his voice softer now. "Just this once. Let's be brave together." I took a shaky breath, uncertainty clawing at me. "You promise it's safe?" "I promise," he said, though I could hear the quiver in his voice. "Just let me in, please." With a resigned sigh, I reached for the doorknob, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The moment my fingers wrapped around the cold metal, I hesitated. "What if it's too late?" I whispered, almost to myself. "It's never too late," Pilar insisted, urgency creeping back into his tone. "Just open it." I turned the knob and pulled the door open, a rush of cold air enveloping me. The night outside felt thick with tension, as if the darkness itself was alive. Pilar rushed in, and I barely had time to step back before he was on me, grabbing my shoulders. "We have to go," he said, his eyes wide with determination. "We can't waste time." "What do you mean go? Where?" I stammered, glancing around the darkened hallway, the shadows seeming to pulse with unease. "The woods." "We have to go back where we found Bobby," he said, urgency drenching his words. We need to confront it. If it's out there, we can't just sit here waiting for it to take us to. I felt a surge of fear clawing up my throat, but there was something else too, a flicker of resolve. Maybe he was right. If we didn't do something, we'd always wonder what could have been. Okay, I said, forcing the words out. Let's do it, but we stick together, no matter what. Tyler nodded vigorously, his grip on my arm firm. Right, together. We stepped outside, the chill of the night wrapping around us like a shroud. The sky was a deep indigo, stars obscured by thick clouds. As we crossed the street, I felt my heart quicken, an instinctive reaction to the unknown that awaited us dart with each step toward the park. I felt as if we were walking deeper into a nightmare. The shadows grew longer, more pronounced, as if the trees themselves were trying to swallow us whole. What if it's already waiting for us? I whispered, glancing around, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners of my vision. It's okay, Tyler said, but his voice trembled slightly. We'll face it together. As we entered the park, the familiar sounds of the night faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. The swings creaked softly in the wind, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. Where did we see it last? I asked, trying to keep my fear at bay. The clearing, Tyler replied, his voice steady but low. That's where we need to go. We made our way to the clearing, every sound magnified in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, as if the darkness itself was waiting to pounce. As we reached the clearing, I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt charged, thick with tension, and I could see the remnants of our last encounter lingering in the shadows. Bobby, Tyler shouted, breaking the silence. Are you here? For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. Help me, Tyler and I exchanged frantic glances. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart racing. Yeah, he replied, his eyes wide with fear. Bobby, the whisper came again, drawing us further into the clearing. Help me. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. This isn't right, I said, doubt creeping in. Come on, Tyler urged, moving forward. We can't turn back now. As we approached the source of the voice, the shadows seemed to shift and twist, coalescing into shapes that danced just beyond our reach. Bobby, Tyler called again, desperation clawing at his voice. Where are you? The shadows began to swirl, forming a dark figure at the center of the clearing. It loomed larger, a mass of darkness that felt alive, pulsating with an energy that made my skin crawl. Help me. The voice echoed again, but this time it was laced with a deep sadness that sent shivers down my spine. What do you want? I shouted, trying to find my voice amidst the fear that threatened to consume me. Bring him to me. The figure intoned, its voice reverberating through the air. Who? I asked, my throat dry. Bobby, it whispered, the shadows swirling more violently around us. He belongs with us. No. I shouted, stepping back. He's gone. Tyler stood beside me, his hands clenched into fists. You can't have him. You have to let him go. The figure seemed to swell, a monstrous shadow that reached out toward us. You cannot fight what you do not understand. He is part of us now. A surge of fear coursed through me, and I took another step back, pulling Tyler with me. We won't let you take him. The shadows began to close in, swirling around us like a storm. Join us, or lose him forever. Don't listen to it. I yelled, feeling the weight of despair pressing down on us. Bobby. Tyler called, his voice breaking. We're here. Fight it. You can break free, Help me. The voice echoed, but now it sounded weaker, as if it were fading. Bobby, I cried, desperate to reach him. You have to fight. We're not leaving you. In that moment, the shadows recoiled slightly, as if our words were piercing through the veil of darkness. I could see a flicker of light deep within the mass, a glimmer of hope that ignited a spark in my chest. Together, I shouted, my voice rising above the chaos. We have to do this together. Tyler nodded, his fear morphing into determination. We won't let you go. As we joined hands, a surge of energy flowed between us. The shadows recoiled again, and I could feel the darkness wavering. Fight it, Bobby. I yelled, pouring every ounce of my hope into the words. With a roar, the figure lunged at us, but we stood firm, united against the encroaching darkness. Together, Tyler shouted, squeezing my hand tightly. The air crackled with energy, and in that moment, I felt Bobby's presence beside us, as if he were reaching out from the shadows, fighting against the tide of despair. Help me. His voice cried again, but this time it was stronger, clearer. Hold on, Bobby. I shouted, determination surging through me. We're coming for you. The shadows shrieked in fury, thrashing around us as if trying to break our bond. You cannot save him, it bellowed. He is ours. No. I cried, my voice rising above the chaos. He is our friend. We will not abandon him. And then, with a blinding flash, light erupted from our joined hands, illuminating the clearing and driving back the shadows. The darkness screamed, a terrible sound that echoed through the trees, but we held firm, our light growing stronger. Bobby, come to us. Tyler shouted, his voice unwavering. The light enveloped us, and I could see Bobby's figure emerging from the shadows, a look of fierce determination on his face. I'm not giving up, he shouted, and as he reached for us, the darkness faltered, swirling around him in confusion. Come on. I yelled, my heart racing. You can break free. With one final push, Bobby broke free from the grip of the shadows, bursting into the light. The figure howled in rage, but we stood our ground, our bond unyielding. You will not take him. We shouted together, the power of our friendship surging through us like a tidal wave. With a deafening roar, the shadows collapsed, retreating into the night as if consumed by our light. And in that moment, everything went silent. Bobby stood before us, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with disbelief. We did it, he said, voice shaking. Yes, I breathed, my heart racing with adrenaline. We really did. But as the echoes of our victory faded, I felt a weight settle over us, the reality of what had just happened crashing down like a wave. What was that thing? Bobby asked, looking between us, fear flickering in his eyes. I shook my head, struggling to find the right words. I don't know, but it's not over yet. What do you mean? Bobby asked, his brows furrowing. The darkness, I said slowly. It's still out there. We fought it, but it will come back. Tyler nodded, his expression grim. We have to be ready. We can't let it take anyone else. Bobby looked between us, and in that moment, I saw the spark of determination igniting within him. Then we'll fight, he said firmly, together. As we stood there, surrounded by the remnants of darkness, I felt a sense of hope flickering in the night. We had faced the shadows and emerged stronger, bound together by our friendship and determination. And while the darkness might come for us again, we would stand ready to face it. Together. I wouldn't give you, Tyler. I wouldn't give Bobby. The words hung in the air like a promise, but I could hear Tyler's choked sobs, the way he dropped the bat as if it weighed too much for him to carry. It clattered on the walkway, the sound a jarring contrast to the oppressive silence that enveloped us. The rope fell to the ground, landing softly on the patch of dirt where we used to play baseball, the spot that had become a graveyard for our childhood. "I love you," I swore I heard him say, the anguish in his voice slicing through the despair like a knife. He didn't scream like Bobby had, but the pain in his voice was a scream all its own, echoing in the empty space where laughter used to reside. When the noise faded, and I found the courage to move again, I opened the door. What I found outside froze me in place. Pilar had brought more than just a rope and a bat. I spotted his school backpack by the curb, its contents spilling out in the dim morning light. There, among the scattered items, was a carving knife, handcuffs probably in case the rope didn't suffice, a barbecue lighter, and lighter fluid. But what gripped my heart the most was a letter, crumpled and weathered, lying near the bag. With trembling hands, I picked up the letter and unfolded it. Pilar's familiar scrawl leapt off the page, detailing a plan that felt like a twisted dream, a desperate escape, a promise to run away together, to leave behind the darkness that had swallowed us whole. I sat on the curb, clutching that letter like a lifeline until mid-morning, the sun rising slowly in the sky, marking the turmoil within me. My mom found me there, concern etched on her face, and soon the police were called. But how could I explain? How could I put into words the horrors we had faced, the visions that had haunted us? All I could offer was a fragmented tale of our father's return, a nonsensical story that made me feel like I was losing my mind. They looked at me as if I were the crazy one, while Pilar's written version became the dominant narrative, the brave friend who had a plan, the one who tried to save us. Eventually, we moved across town. There was nothing left for my mom or me on Ferry Street. We packed our lives into boxes and carried on, trying to find normalcy in a world that felt forever altered. I did everything I was told: therapy, support groups, the works, but nothing seemed to fill the void. The hollow feeling settled deep within me like a heavy stone, and while I could occasionally lose myself in the noise of a crowd, real joy slipped through my fingers like sand. I felt like a ghost, haunting the memories of what I had lost, and the days that should have been filled with happiness only reminded me of the darkness lurking in the corners of my mind. To say my sanity was compromised would be an understatement. I thought I had buried the past, but then it happened again. I woke up at 2:59 a.m. The familiar dread washed over me, but this time I didn't get out of bed. I lay still, heart pounding, fear wrapping around me like a shroud. But it didn't stop. Night after night, I woke up at that same cursed time, the darkness creeping in around me. And last night, I didn't go to the window like I had done before. Instead, I walked to the door. I grasped the handle, my breath hitching as I felt the cold metal beneath my palm. I couldn't think of a single reason not to go outside. Every excuse evaporated in the face of the overwhelming pull of curiosity. Only soul-rending fear held me back, keeping me anchored inside, but I could overcome it. Pilar did. Maybe tonight would be different. If I opened the door, I would see his face again, one last time, alive, and then it would finally be over. I took a deep breath, gathering my resolve. The shadows of my memories danced in my mind, whispering reminders of everything I had lost. With one final glance back at my room, I turned the doorknob. The creaking of the hinges echoed in the silence as I stepped outside. The night was still, the air heavy with anticipation. I took a hesitant step into the darkness, the world around me bathed in a pale moonlight that felt both comforting and threatening. "Pilar," I called out, my voice shaky but firm. "Are you here?" The only response was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, a sound that felt like a whisper of encouragement, urging me to keep moving forward. I stepped further into the night, heart racing, each footfall echoing in the stillness. The familiar path to the park lay ahead, shrouded in darkness, but tonight I felt a glimmer of hope pushing me forward. Together, I whispered to myself, and with each word, I felt the fear start to dissolve, replaced by the determination to confront whatever had haunted me for so long. As I made my way toward the clearing, the shadows flickered around me, dancing in the periphery of my vision. The trees seemed to lean in, watching, waiting for me to take that final step into the unknown. Just one more time, I murmured, hoping against hope that this time I would find the answers I had been searching for. With each step, I felt closer to the truth, to the friends I had lost, and the darkness that sought to consume us. Tonight, I would face it all. I would finally confront the nightmares that had haunted me for far too long. And as I reached the clearing, I stood firm, ready to reclaim my past and confront the shadows that had tried to take everything from me. Pilar, I called out into the night, voice steady. I'm here. I'm not afraid anymore. But deep down, I knew the real battle was only just beginning. Do you remember all the things you were scared of when you were little? If you really think back, you'll probably remember a bunch of them. Some of those fears were likely silly, like quicksand or lava. Others were more rational, drowning, getting lost. And, of course, the classics like the dark, spiders, and monsters under the bed. For me, it was that last one that haunted me the most. The idea of something lurking just under my bed, waiting to grab me the moment I let my guard down. I'd wrap myself tightly in my blankets, as though they could protect me from whatever terrible thing was hiding below. No matter how many times I tried to convince myself that nothing was really under there, the fear would never fully go away. My mom would check under the bed, reassure me that everything was fine, but I could never quite believe her. It was always possible, my young brain told me, that something was just hiding when she looked, or worse, that it had appeared after she left. This fear made falling asleep nearly impossible. Every time I got close, I'd hear some tiny sound, a creak in the floor, a rustle from the curtains, normal noises that, to my child's mind, were signs of the monster stirring beneath me. I imagined sharp claws, gleaming eyes, and fangs dripping with saliva, waiting to strike. As I got older, the fear faded a little. After all, I couldn't let my friends know I was scared of monsters under the bed at the age of 10. That would be embarrassing. Still, some nights the old terror would return, and I'd spend the night bleary-eyed and sleepless, waiting for morning. Then, when I turned 13, I found a solution. My parents, after much pleading, finally gave me a phone. It wasn't anything fancy, an old hand-me-down from my grandma, but it had a camera. One night, when the fear crept back in, I had a brilliant idea. I would use the camera to snap a photo under the bed. If there was something down there, I'd see it, and if not, I could relax and fall asleep. It worked like a charm. Every time the fear returned, I'd take a quick picture, and, without fail, it would show nothing but empty space. Knowing I had proof that nothing was down there allowed me to sleep peacefully. Over time, I stopped needing the camera at all. The more photos I took, the more I trusted that nothing was lurking in the darkness. By the time I left for college, the whole thing seemed silly, a childish fear I'd outgrown. Years passed, and I hadn't thought about monsters under the bed in a decade. I graduated, started a career, and bought my own house in a quiet neighborhood. I lived alone, and I felt safe, comfortable. Everything was perfect. Until tonight, I woke up suddenly, heart racing, drenched in sweat. It felt like I'd been having a nightmare, though I couldn't remember any of the details. My eyes scanned the dark room, and, gradually, I began to calm down. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the quiet stillness of the night. I took a deep breath, adjusted my blanket, and prepared to drift back to sleep. But then, something I hadn't felt in years crept back in, the gnawing suspicion that something was under my bed. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a leftover anxiety from waking up so suddenly. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it grew. Every sound, every faint creak and rustle, felt like proof that something was down there. In a moment of panic, I peeked through the small gap between my mattress and the bed frame, and for just a second, I thought I saw something shift in the darkness. My chest tightened, and I fought the urge to flee. That's when I remembered my old trick. I could take a picture, just like I used to. With trembling hands, I reached over the side of the bed, groping for my phone on the floor. My heart was pounding as I positioned it so the camera faced the space beneath me. I couldn't help but imagine something cold and clawed wrapping around my hand. I was seconds away from snapping the photo when something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My phone's screen flickered on, and something that had once comforted me now filled me with dread. You see, my old phone had required a passcode to unlock. But the phone I had now, my sleek, modern smartphone, came with the latest technology. It had Face ID. I never took the picture. The moment I pointed the camera under the bed, the screen lit up, and I saw the tiny padlock at the top of the screen flip open. I hadn't looked at the camera, and there was no one else in the room, but the phone had recognized a face. I'm typing this from the safety of my bed, but I don't know how much time I have left. There's something under my bed. I don't know what it wants, but I know it looks just like me. And now, it knows I'm here. When I worked as a grade school teacher, 4th grade specifically, I'd never faced any problems with the kids I taught. Nothing more than the typical boisterous boys, who I suppose nowadays would have been chalked up to undiagnosed ADHD, and girls who might have been a bit too cruel to one another, in the way all children need time to grow to be kinder when dealing with classmates. This was before the time of widespread use of computers in schools, and in the small town of Witness, in the lower southeastern part of Iowa, there would be a long wait for our left-behind town to see computers enter our school system. It wasn't the worst thing to be dealing with the old-fashioned way of education. Filing papers and student files for classes of no more than 10 to 12 students didn't make my life complicated. Witness was extremely tight-knit. I never had to worry much about getting into contact with parents, and more often than not, had been invited for dinner at my pupils' houses, in order to grow comfortable with the community. As the new girl in town, it seemed customary to be thrown straight into the town's communal nature, and within my first year moving there, I'd come to know almost every resident by name. They were all more than happy to accommodate the fresh, new teacher from Manhattan, confident I'd bring some quality teaching tactics to their otherwise crumbling education system. I was fresh out of college when I moved to Witness. Truth be told, I hadn't been entirely honest with my reasoning for moving to the town when speaking with its residents. To them, they assumed that my education in Manhattan made me something of a higher class. A shiny, bright person far more worldly than anyone they'd ever met before. Someone well versed in the ever-changing landscape of the time, who'd attended one of the best colleges around. While it wasn't entirely untrue, their praise for me came more from their own failings at the hands of a state government that didn't see fit to pour money into a dwindling town like Witness. Their awe at my intelligence was no more than their inability to explore their own, and their interest in my so-called worldly life was born from their powerlessness to leave the town they'd grown up in. My untruthfulness came more from what I withheld. A left-behind place like Witness probably wouldn't have taken kindly to the fact that I'd moved here to leave my previous life behind. A fiancé whom I'd abandoned after his discovery of my abortion would likely have turned their acts of kindness into vitriol and cruel gossip. This was no fault of theirs. It was a time when residents in towns like Witness weren't the most progressive types, and I wouldn't have expected them to change their tune just for me. Besides, I preferred to keep my secrets just that, secret, and to start my life afresh with nothing to tie me down. I was 24 when Timmy Thompson and his parents moved to Witness. There had been talk around the town before the new semester. Mrs. Greaves, who worked at the grocery store, asked me if I'd heard about the new kid who'd been scheduled to join my class. I'd been surprised at her question, as it was only a week before the semester was to begin, and I hadn't been alerted of a new arrival by the principal. It wasn't that we never had new students join the school, but they were few and far between. The last child to join the grade school had been a young female student who transferred in the same year I did, but she only stayed for 5th grade before moving on to the middle school in the next town over. The day Timmy arrived was overcast, a gloomy grayness that always made the first day back a little more difficult. Parents stood with their kids in front of the school, and there was Timmy, flanked by his mother and father, both of whom wore expressions that seemed worn out from life. Timmy looked equally as pale and withdrawn, his eyes focused down at his scuffed shoes, as though he were trying to disappear right there on the spot. The other students ignored him, too busy with their own excitement of seeing friends after the summer break. As the bell rang, I caught Timmy's gaze, but he quickly looked away. I couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for him. Moving to a new town, especially a town like Witness, was tough enough for an adult like me. For a child like Timmy, it must have been unbearable. I introduced him to the class, and though he gave a brief smile, it didn't reach his eyes. He sat in the back row, quiet and observant. Unlike the other boys, who would chatter and sometimes sneak in playful arguments, Timmy was almost unnervingly well behaved. I caught him staring off into space several times that day, as though lost in a world only he could see. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get to know him, to pull him out of his shell, but every time I asked him about his family, his old school, or even his favorite subjects, he'd answer with no more than a word or two, then retreat into silence. Something wasn't right about the Thompson family. Other parents in town noticed it, too. They whispered about how Mrs. Thompson never seemed to smile, and how Mr. Thompson spent long nights at the bar just outside town. There were rumors of strange things happening at their house, the lights flickering late into the night, and a loud banging sound that would carry through the otherwise silent neighborhood. Then, one evening after school, Timmy didn't show up for class. Days passed, and still, there was no sign of him. His parents stopped answering their phone, and the once buzzing rumors around town fell into an eerie quiet. It wasn't until the police were called that the truth about Timmy and his family came to light. A truth that none of us had been prepared to face. Mrs. Greaves mentioned that my lack of knowledge about the new student must have been because the family moved to town barely 2 weeks before the semester started. She gossiped a bit, saying they'd hardly visited the grocery store, except for the day they arrived, and that maybe they were cut from a different cloth, possibly shopping at the Hinky-Dinky instead. I smiled and nodded, taking her comments with a grain of salt. The same things had been said about me when I first arrived, so I figured everyone had their reasons for keeping parts of their lives private. I decided to wait until I met Timmy Thompson's parents before jumping to conclusions. It took almost another week before Principal Dale finally gave me any information about the new student. The Friday before the semester started, all the teachers and staff came in for meetings and to prepare the classrooms and hallways for the new school year. The meetings were usually brief, discussing the budget and reviewing policies, including the allergy policy, which, though unchanged, was always emphasized. As I stapled posters onto the classroom's bulletin board, Principal Dale knocked on my door. He looked nervous, as he often did, with his blotchy red cheeks adding to his awkward demeanor. He asked me to join him in his office to discuss the new student, which seemed odd, considering we could have spoken in the classroom. My curiosity grew when he slid a small file across the desk with the name Timmy Thompson written on the side. I apologize for leaving this so last minute, Miss Harris, but I assure you it wasn't due to any tardiness on my part, he began, sitting stiffly in his chair. I waited for him to continue, but he fidgeted under my gaze, struggling to find the right words. Your new student, Thompson, well, he's suffered quite a bit recently. Tired of his stalling, I opened the file, but he quickly stopped me. Miss Harris, I'd advise you to read this at home, away from prying eyes. Gossip spreads fast here. As you know, he wiped the sweat from his balding head with a tissue. With all due respect, Principal Dale, I'm confused. What's the issue with Timmy Thompson? Is there something I should be aware of? I asked, glancing at the file. Principal Dale sighed, his shoulders relaxing as the tension left his body. Young Thompson, you see, he was missing for 4 months earlier this year. I must have shown my shock because he nodded urgently. His parents reported him missing after he didn't come home from school one day. The bus driver saw him get off at his stop, but after that, nothing. I stared at him, my heart sinking as he continued. It was a nightmare for his parents, as you can imagine. The town searched for him for months. And then, just like that, he returned home. Not a scratch on him, but... Principal Dale paused again, nervously tapping his fingers on the desk. He's not in a good mental state. He hasn't been much trouble so far, but he's withdrawn, doesn't talk much at all. His parents have arranged for Dr. Fielding to check on him weekly, but I thought you should know his history. It'd be best to keep an eye on him and make sure he adjusts well in your class. The Thompsons have been through enough. I nodded, thanking him for the information and leaving his office. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. Timmy Thompson had been missing for months, and now he was back, physically unharmed, but mentally different. The thought lingered with me as I returned to my classroom, trying to imagine what it must have been like for him, and what could have possibly happened during those missing months. As I finished setting up the classroom for the new semester, my mind kept wandering back to that file, sitting in my bag, waiting to be read. What had Timmy gone through? And why did I have the sense that this was just the beginning of something far more disturbing than the principal had let on? Timmy, did the Thompsons ever mention what had happened to him while he was missing? Where he was? I pressed, trying to get more information from Principal Dale. It would be important for his well-being if I knew as much as possible, so I could avoid placing him under any unnecessary stress. The principal sighed, his eyes darting around the room before settling on the file in my hands. "The Thompsons' telephone number is in the file. I hadn't asked them directly. It's clear it's a painful subject. I trust you won't be disrespectful, but keep in mind they've likely dealt with a lot of prying eyes already. They came to witness for some peace, and I doubt they'd appreciate having to relive the ordeal." I understood. The minute I'd heard about Timmy's disappearance and mysterious reappearance, it was clear the family had sought refuge in a place like Witness, a town where people knew each other by name and kept a close eye on everything. In Witness, a child going missing wouldn't have gone unnoticed. The town would have rallied immediately, neighbors scouring the streets in search of a missing child. It just didn't happen here. Later that evening, after I returned home and made myself a cup of coffee, I sat down with Timmy's file. Tracing my fingers over his name, I made a mental note to never forget it. Inside the file, I found a school picture, a lean, tall boy with sandy blonde hair and an upturned nose. His grin was wide, showing a gap where a front tooth had been. The smile was genuine, but I wondered if he'd smiled like that since he came back. My heart ached at the thought that he likely hadn't. The file revealed that the Thompsons had previously lived in Indianapolis, where Timmy had been doing quite well in school. His grades were above average until January of that year. After that, there was a blank. Timmy had been pulled out of school in late April, right in the middle of the school year. I realized I'd have to call his mother to see if he had any schooling during that time. If not, he might be behind, and I wanted to do everything possible to help him catch up. I was never one to let a child fall through the cracks, and since I had plenty of free time outside of work, I could offer extra lessons if needed. Around 7:30 p.m., I made the call to the Thompsons' residence. From experience, I knew parents of children Timmy's age usually ate dinner early. After a few rings, a small, quiet voice answered, filled with uncertainty. "Hello, this is Miss Harris, the 4th grade teacher at Witness Elementary. Is this Mrs. Thompson I'm speaking with?" I could hear a sigh of relief from the other end of the line, and I frowned. The poor family must have been overwhelmed with stress. Double quotes, "Yes, this is Mrs. Thompson. It's nice to speak with you, Miss Harris." "How can I help you?" she replied, her voice soft, but I could sense the tension lifting. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." I asked politely. "I wanted to ask a few questions about your son Timmy, if that's all right." I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line, and I quickly clarified. "Just to clear up a few things about his education, so that we can best support him at school." Another sigh, this time of relief, and Mrs. Thompson urged me to continue. "I've been made aware of your situation," I began carefully, "and I want to extend my deepest sympathies for what your family has been through. I noticed in Timmy's file that he was withdrawn from school in late April. I'm wondering if he received any remedial education during that time. If not, I'd be happy to work with you and your husband to discuss any remedial classes he might need to catch up with the rest of the class." There was a long pause on the line, and I waited patiently, knowing that this was likely a difficult conversation for her. There was a pause. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make me uneasy, and I wondered if Mrs. Thompson had hung up. But then she spoke, her voice quieter now. "Yes, sorry, yes. He did receive some education from me, and at the hospital. I don't think remedial classes will be necessary, but thank you for offering." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson," I replied, though skepticism crept into my thoughts. A child missing for months, receiving only sporadic education. It seemed unlikely that Timmy had kept pace with the rest of the class. Still, I decided not to press her further. Once he started school, I'd assess his progress myself and address any gaps. "Is there anything else you'd like me to know about Timmy?" I asked, my tone gentle. "Something that might help me accommodate his needs, or perhaps prevent him from being reminded of what happened." Another long pause. I imagined her exchanging glances with her husband, weighing what to share with me. Finally, she spoke again, though her voice wavered. "Timmy will be fine. Just try to make sure he gets along with the other children." Her words sent a small shiver down my spine. Something in her voice, a fragile undercurrent of fear or hesitation, made me uneasy. We exchanged polite goodbyes, and I found myself sitting in my living room, flipping through Timmy's file again, searching for any clue I might have missed about his character or past. But the file remained as clean as it had the first time I read it. The only strange blot on his otherwise ordinary life was his unexplained disappearance. The next few days, the town of Witness buzzed with gossip about the Thompsons. Though I hadn't met the family yet, many of the ladies at the library's book club seemed fascinated by their arrival. I overheard snippets of conversation, speculation about Mr. Thompson's job, Mrs. Thompson's appearance, and what sort of lifestyle they might lead. "They're a young couple, you know, quite good-looking," one of them mentioned. Mrs. Greaves added that she'd seen them at the grocery store, buying mostly frozen meals and sugary snacks. "Not the healthiest for a growing boy," she'd remarked with a disapproving shake of her head. I'd nodded along, but kept my thoughts to myself. After what the family had been through, I could understand the desire to spoil Timmy a little. Monday morning arrived, and with it, my first sighting of Timmy Thompson in the flesh. He was dropped off early by his father, far ahead of the usual crowd of children. Mr. Thompson, a tall and handsome man, couldn't have been much older than me, but the gauntness in his face betrayed sleepless nights. His polite smile felt strained, and I wondered if the events surrounding his son's disappearance still haunted him. Timmy, tall for his age like his father, followed behind, walking with a stiffness that made him seem older than his years. Our exchange was brief. Mr. Thompson excused himself for work, his tie slightly askew as if he'd rushed through the morning routine. I took Timmy under my wing, guiding him through the quiet halls as the school slowly came to life. "Are you excited for your first day at a new school?" I asked, keeping my voice light and cheerful. Timmy looked up at me briefly, then quickly averted his gaze to the floor. "I guess," he mumbled, his voice flat. I smiled, trying to reassure him. "It must be nerve-wracking. Ha, don't worry, the kids here are really nice. You'll make friends in no time." He nodded, but his silence suggested he wasn't interested in continuing the conversation. We reached the classroom, and I gestured toward the rows of desks. "You can sit wherever you like." Without hesitation, Timmy chose the seat furthest from the front of the room, right by the window. He placed his backpack on the desk and stared out at the sky, his body rigid. I approached him, trying to engage. "You can store your backpack in here," I said, lifting the lid of his desk to show him the compartment. He nodded but didn't respond, his gaze never leaving the window. The sky outside was overcast, the clouds thick and heavy, yet Timmy seemed transfixed by it. I wondered what he was thinking, what memories might be drifting through his mind as he stared blankly at the grey expanse. But I didn't press further. I returned to my desk and busied myself with preparing for the day, keeping a watchful eye on him as the other students filed in, chattering excitedly about their summers and reuniting with friends. Timmy remained motionless. He didn't even glance at his classmates. When the bell rang, I called the class to attention, and the room filled with eager, smiling faces. For the first time, Timmy tore his gaze from the window and looked toward the front of the room, his expression unreadable to break the ice. I introduced a game where each student had to state their name and share a fun fact about themselves. The usual answers popped up: favorite colors, foods, hobbies. Each one met with giggles and knowing glances, the children relishing inside jokes from years of friendship. Finally, it was Timmy's turn. He stood slowly, all eyes on him. The children leaned in, curious to hear from the new kid. But Timmy didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he looked straight at me. "My name is Timmy Thompson," he said in a monotone, "and I don't have any fun facts." He sat down immediately, his attention snapping back to the window. The class exchanged confused glances, unsure how to react. I forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. Well, not having fun facts is a fun fact in itself, right? A few kids giggled, and the room's energy lightened again, though the curiosity surrounding Timmy lingered. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. When the bell rang for recess, I made my way to the staff room, grateful for a few moments to myself. I grabbed a cup of coffee and glanced out the window, which provided a clear view of the playground. The children ran and played, laughter echoing through the air. Then I saw Timmy. He stood by the swing set, a head taller than the boys around him. They were talking to him, chirping excitedly, though he responded only occasionally with short, clipped answers. Even from a distance, I could sense the awkwardness in the interactions. But there was something else, something about the way Timmy towered over the other boys, his expression still blank and distant, that made me uneasy. When it was Timmy's turn to present, the room fell silent, as if the other children instinctively knew that this would be different. He stood up, carrying his poster with care, and walked to the front of the class, where he propped it up on the chalkboard. His poster wasn't like the others. While the other kids had drawn colorful planets and stars, Timmy's was almost entirely black, save for a few small white dots and one large, blood-red circle near the bottom corner. The title of his project was written in thin, shaky letters: "The Black Sun." "What you're looking at," Timmy began, his voice steady but cold, "is something older than our solar system. Something that's out there, beyond the stars we know." A chill ran through me as he spoke. The children in the room were unusually quiet, their usual chatter subdued in the face of Timmy's strange presentation. "This," he pointed to the red circle, "is what some people call the Black Sun. It's not really black, though. It's red, but dark, darker than anything we can imagine. It doesn't give off light like our sun. It takes light away." I couldn't help but feel unsettled by his words. There was an eerie precision to his tone, like he wasn't just reciting something he'd read, but something he knew firsthand. "What happens when it comes close?" one of the children asked, breaking the silence. Timmy turned his gaze to the child, his expression unchanging. "When it gets close, it makes everything go away. The stars, the planets, even time. It just swallows it all up." I took a step forward, unsure of how to proceed. "That's very interesting, Timmy," I said cautiously. "But where did you learn about the Black Sun? I haven't heard of it before." Timmy didn't look at me. He stared at the red circle on his poster. "I didn't learn about it," he replied quietly. "I've seen it." A thick silence fell over the room. The children, who had been captivated by his words, now looked confused and scared. One of the girls in the front row shifted nervously in her seat. I cleared my throat. trying to regain control of the situation. "Thank you, Timmy. That was a very creative project." Let's all give him a round of applause. A few tentative claps followed, but Timmy didn't seem to care. He carefully took his poster and returned to his seat, once again turning his gaze to the window and the cloudy sky outside. The rest of the presentations were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what Timmy had said, or the way he had said it. There was something deeply unsettling about his words, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. After class, I watched as Timmy's father came to pick him up. Mr. Thompson looked as gaunt and tired as ever, his face pale against the winter chill. He didn't smile as he greeted Timmy, and Timmy didn't seem to acknowledge his presence beyond getting into the car. As they drove away, I stood at the window, my eyes following them until they disappeared down the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, not just with Timmy, but with the Thompsons as a whole. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifting back to Timmy's words. "It swallows everything up." I didn't know why, but I couldn't get the image of that red circle out of my mind. And as I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of a sky where no stars shone, and a sun that gave off no warmth, only cold, endless darkness. Mr. Thompson cut me off mid-sentence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please. Lower your voice," he begged, his eyes darting to the window as though something or someone might be listening. Mrs. Thompson's scratching intensified, her frail fingers now red from the constant friction. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and I found myself growing more uncomfortable by the second. Why would I began again, but Mr. Thompson silenced me with a harsh shake of his head, his face pale and taut with fear. "We've noticed some things," he began, his voice trembling. "Timmy. He's been different since the accident." I blinked, taken aback. "The accident? You mean the one earlier in the year?" Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "It's not just at home. He's changed here at school too, hasn't he?" Mrs. Thompson finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her eyes were pleading with me, desperate for some kind of confirmation. I paused, weighing my words carefully. "He's quieter, yes, more withdrawn, I'd say. But he's still excelling in his work. His classmates respect him." Mrs. Thompson shook her head frantically, her gaze flickering to the window. "That's not what I mean. He's not our Timmy anymore. Not since he saw it." Mr. Thompson shot her a look that silenced her immediately, but it was too late. I had caught the slip, and there was no way I was going to let it go. "So what?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, my voice soft but firm. Mr. Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples as though fighting off a terrible headache. "He doesn't sleep any more, not really. He stares out the window all night, just like he does in your classroom. He used to be afraid of the dark, but now he's drawn to it." Mrs. Thompson looked as though she was about to burst into tears, her hands trembling violently. "It's the stars. He says he can see something in the stars. Something." Watching him, I felt a chill run down my spine. The image of Timmy's vacant stares out the window flashed in my mind. "What exactly does he say he sees?" I asked cautiously, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. "He calls it the black sun," Mr. Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. My heart skipped a beat. The black sun, the same thing Timmy had talked about during his space project. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. "We've tried everything," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice breaking. doctors, counselors ... But nothing helps. He's slipping away from us. It's like he's being pulled somewhere we can't follow." Mr. Thompson clenched his jaw, his face hardening with determination. "He needs help. Real help. We don't know what's happening to him. But it's not ... normal. It's like he's seeing something no one else can." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I wasn't a psychologist or a doctor. I was just a schoolteacher, and I had never encountered anything like this before. But I couldn't ignore the eerie feeling that had been growing inside me ever since Timmy's strange behavior began. "I'll keep an eye on him," I offered finally, feeling woefully inadequate. "If anything unusual happens, I'll let you know immediately." Mr. Thompson nodded grimly, but there was a hollow look in his eyes that made me wonder if he believed anything could be done at this point. Mrs. Thompson simply sat there, staring at her trembling hands as I escorted them to the door. Mr. Thompson hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. He turned back to me, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Harris, please be careful," he warned quietly. "Sometimes, when Timmy stares at something too long, it starts staring back." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me standing alone in the dim classroom, the shadows growing long as the winter sun began to set outside. I glanced toward the window, where the bare branches of the oak tree swayed in the cold wind, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something, a faint shimmer, almost like a shadow, lingering just beyond the glass. Timmy had been close to last in presenting his poster. Other children were far more eager to raise their hands, desperate to be picked to present next. He moved with a slow, sunken demeanor to the front of the room, tightly clutching his poster. The paper crinkled at the edges from his grip. At the time, I'd assumed it was just nerves, social anxiety that wouldn't be unusual for a boy like Timmy. He had plenty of friends, but was never much of a talker. His project was on the solar system, a topic far broader than those of his peers. He explained the distances between planets and their basic states, focusing on what we knew back then. He talked about how Earth was a Goldilocks planet, the perfect climate for life to flourish. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his presentation until it came time for questions. Then something shifted. The nervous, quiet Timmy seemed to disappear. In his place was an animated, confident boy answering every question with precision and enthusiasm. It was a drastic change. I found myself smiling, happy to see him enjoy the attention. For the first time, it felt like he was moving on from the tragedy that had struck his family earlier in the year. I'd already decided to give him an A. His engagement and knowledge were impressive. But then, a question from Jenny Powell changed everything. "Why didn't you talk about Pluto?" "Pluto's my favorite," she asked, giggling. The other kids waited eagerly for his response. I was curious myself, realizing I hadn't noticed the omission. Timmy stood there, silent at first, staring at Jenny in a way that made her shrink in her seat. His eyes were locked on her, his face completely expressionless. Then slowly, he turned to look at me, and a small, chilling smirk crept onto his face. "That's because Pluto isn't a planet," he said, rolling his eyes at the murmurs of shock from his classmates. His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. He shook his head, clearly holding back a scoff. I quickly intervened, reminding the class that Pluto was still considered a planet, and told Timmy to save jokes for another time. He just stared at me with that same vacant expression and then looked out the window until the class was dismissed for winter break. When the new semester began, I implemented a seating plan to settle the rowdier students by placing them next to quieter ones. Timmy asked if he could still sit by the window, and I declined, explaining that sometimes we had to do things we didn't want to prepare for adult life. It's a sentiment I don't hold anymore, but at the time, it was what we believed. Timmy scowled but didn't argue. He sat down and made a point to stare toward the window, even though he was now seated at the front of the classroom. A few days later, his parents requested a meeting with me, but unlike other families, they didn't invite me to their home. Instead, we met in my classroom after hours. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were unsettling. Mrs. Thompson, a small, fragile-looking woman, couldn't stop scratching her wrist, a nervous tic she seemed to be trying to control. Mr. Thompson, whom I remembered as a strong, charismatic man, now appeared hollow and sickly, with deep bags under his eyes. He couldn't meet my gaze, and there was a tension between them that I couldn't quite place. "It's nice to meet you both," I said, offering my hand to Mrs. Thompson. She flinched, looking to her husband for guidance. He shook his head, and she dropped her gaze, scratching more furiously at her wrist. Mr. Thompson gave me a look that made my stomach churn, a mix of fear and desperation. He put a finger to his lips and glanced toward the classroom window. Confused, I asked, "What's wrong? Why are you?" He slammed his fist on the desk, trembling as he gestured frantically for me to hand him something to write with. I slid my journal across the desk, and he began scribbling furiously while speaking aloud in a trembling voice. We wanted to ask if Timmy could sit in his old seat by the window. "It comforts him," he said, his voice shaking. When he handed the journal back to me, I read the note. "Keep speaking." I glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who was now silently mouthing a prayer. I scribbled a quick response in the journal. "Who is listening? We understand that sometimes changes have to be made, but for Timmy's sake, we're asking for a small accommodation." Mr. Thompson continued, while writing another note. "That is not our son." My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to respond calmly. "I'll see what I can do about reworking the seating arrangement." Mr. Thompson nodded, but his next note was chilling. "Do not leave the other children alone with him." As they left, Mrs. Thompson shot me a final, desperate look. I didn't know what to make of any of it. I spent the next few weeks on edge, watching Timmy more closely than ever. Strange things started happening in the classroom. The other kids became withdrawn, their personalities shifting in subtle but disturbing ways. They seemed tired, lost, but at home, their parents reported nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, some even said their children were happier than ever, especially around Timmy. It wasn't until the winter festival that everything truly unraveled. Witness had always held a winter festival to lift spirits during the cold, dreary months. I taught my students a few songs to sing, and they performed beautifully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Then I saw Timmy standing with a group of my students, all of them staring blankly, their eyes vacant and white. He raised his hand, as if beckoning to the sky, and I screamed for him to stop. The next moments were a blur. Timmy lifted two of the children, Eric Lowitz and Jenny Powell, into the air. Above them, a monstrous, gaping mouth appeared in the sky, sucking everything into its endless blackness. Timmy smiled. In an instant, the mouth consumed Eric and Jenny, only to spit Timmy back out. The other children snapped back to normal, as if nothing had happened. I looked to Mr. Fitzgerald for help, but his eyes were just as vacant, his grip on my arm tight as he stared at the sky. Whatever had just happened, only Timmy and I seemed to remember. The Thompsons left town the next day, and as quickly as Timmy had appeared, he was forgotten. The other children no longer asked about him, and soon it was as if he had never existed. But I remember, and now, I can't help but wonder if I ever really met the real Timmy Thompson at all. Okay, this one's done, John said, finishing the stitches on the cadaver. Somewhere across the room, the phone rang, cutting through the eerie quiet. Can you grab that? My hands are full, John muttered, his voice barely masking the exhaustion. Yeah, sure, I replied, walking over to the old landline mounted on the wall. A paramedic was on the other end of the line. He told me they had a car crash victim, one fatality, and asked if we could take the body. Standard protocol for our night shift. John, you good for one more tonight? I shouted across the room. Yeah, meet them out front. Let's get this over with. I had just lit a cigarette when the ambulance pulled up, its lights flashing but the sirens eerily quiet. I took a last drag before stubbing it out and wheeled the stretcher inside. Pulling back the sheet, I revealed the face of the victim, and John let out a low whistle. Wow. Do you know who this is? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Nope. Should I? He was a big comedian in the 90s, John replied, more to himself than to me. Despite the celebrity, we went through our usual motions. John did most of the heavy lifting since I was still an intern. He reminded me we couldn't afford to mess this one up. Too high profile. Everything seemed routine until it was and single quotes T. as John finished and I started peeling off my scrubs. A voice echoed through the room. But it wasn't John's. Hey, ever have to pay a parking ticket? And the voice cut off as John screamed, his face pale as he collapsed backward, eyes wide with shock. I spun around, my blood running cold. The cadaver, no, the dead man, was sitting upright on the table. John, what the hell is happening? I don't know. John stammered. This guy is dead. We pumped him full of formaldehyde. And what's the deal with formaldehyde? The corpse quipped, grabbing a scalpel and slicing open its wrist. A stream of liquid shot out, hitting John in the mouth. He choked, spitting out the vile substance as I lunged for something, anything to defend us. Without thinking, I yanked the paper towel dispenser off the wall and hurled it at the thing's head. A sickening crack echoed through the room as the corpse's head bent back at a grotesque angle. Ouch, that was my funny bone. It yelled, twisting its head back into place like it was nothing. John, we need to get the hell out of here. I shouted, grabbing him and dragging him toward the storage room door. John was still coughing and spitting out formaldehyde. Fuck, get us in there. John groaned, clutching his throat as I yanked the door open and shoved us both inside, slamming it shut just as the corpse lunged. Hey, tough crowd. Well, have you heard the one about the priest, the rabbi, and the grizzly bear? The thing continued, banging on the door. My mind raced as I scanned the cramped room. Mop, bucket, extra scrubs, fire extinguisher and axe. Bingo. I smashed the glass and grabbed the axe, tossing the extinguisher to John. Okay, listen. I'll open the door. You blast it with that thing, and I'll do the rest. John nodded weakly, his hands trembling. I could hear the corpse still rattling off jokes on the other side of the door, but the second I unlocked it, there was only silence. I swung the door open, axe raised, but nothing. The corpse had vanished. A split second later, it lunged from the left, knocking me flat on my back. The weight of it pinned me down, its decaying hands clawing at my face as it cackled. Now, John, now. I screamed, barely holding it back. A blast of freezing white foam enveloped us both as John emptied the extinguisher, frosting my glasses. The corpse convulsed, tensing up as its movements slowed. Wow, colder than my ex-wife. It wheezed, its limbs stiffening. Rigor mortis. John shouted, "Spray it again, it's setting in faster." I grabbed the extinguisher and let loose, watching as the thing's jaw froze mid-sentence. With all my strength, I brought the axe down on its neck, severing the head in one brutal swing. I didn't stop. I hacked it into 6 pieces, chopping off the arms, legs, and head from the torso. We stared at the dismembered pieces in horror. What do we do now?" I gasped. "Cremate it," John replied, his voice hollow. "It's the only way." The family wasn't pleased when we explained the necessary cremation instead of the requested open casket. We ended up settling with a top-of-the-line urn to keep the lawyers off our backs. I resigned the next day. Moved far away. I heard John retired shortly after. No one, not even the most seasoned morticians, could explain what happened that night. But I'll never forget it. What do you all make of this? I've always loved the quiet of libraries. The way the air seemed to hum with a subdued reverence, how the dusty scent of old books wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. I used to hang out at my grandma's house when she was still alive and kicking. The place was a bit dusty, though Nana did try her best at dusting, and the old wooden furniture made the air smell ancient, as it should. Surely, you know how the scent of your grandparents' house is, right? It was why I took the job at the city's oldest library. I grew up in that kind of rustic environment, and I thought it would be the perfect place to escape, to lose myself in the endless stacks of long-forgotten stories. But I never imagined I would stumble upon one of my own. It started with a simple accident. I was restocking the history section when my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw the corner of an old, leather-bound book peeking out from beneath a shelf. It was strange. This particular shelf was bolted to the floor, leaving no room for anything to slip underneath. Curious, I knelt and pulled the book free, the spine creaking with age. The title was embossed in gold, though the letters were faded and nearly illegible. It took a moment for me to decipher them. The Library of Echoes. I had never seen or heard of it before, which was odd, given how well I knew the books that should be on this shelf. I turned it over, searching for a barcode or any sign it belonged to our library. There was none. Someone might have accidentally put this back, I thought to myself. So I reported this to our manager to look into via our library system. Finished filing the report, my curiosity got the better of me. A book as old as it looked would definitely contain some sort of vintage novel that would intrigue a geeky bookworm like me. Giddily, I took the book to the back room, where I could examine it without interruption. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, but the text was clear, crisp even, as though the ink had just dried. As I read the first few lines, a strange sensation came over me. The words were familiar, unsettlingly so. The book described a librarian, alone in a vast, ancient library, discovering a hidden book that seemed to have been waiting for them. My hands began to tremble as I continued reading, realizing that the book was describing me, right down to the smallest details of my day. The chair I was sitting in, the coffee I had spilled earlier in the break room, even the way my heart was beginning to race as I read further. I should have stopped, but I couldn't. The story continued, recounting how the librarian, overwhelmed by the impossible nature of the book, would return to the shelves in search of more, how they would find a hidden door, one they had never noticed before, leading to a forgotten section of the library. A place that shouldn't exist. My stomach knotted. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something change, but nothing had. The old walls stood just as they always had, lined with shelves full of worn-out novels, encyclopedias, and archives. I pushed the book away for a moment, feeling unsettled, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. I couldn't resist the urge to follow the path laid out in the pages. I got up, leaving the back room and heading toward the far corner of the library, where the oldest sections lay in silence, untouched by modern visitors. It was colder there, the air still and heavy with the scent of parchment and dust. The rows of books seemed to stretch on endlessly, shadows creeping between the stacks. I scanned the shelves, and then, just as the book had said, I noticed something odd. A door. It was narrow, blending seamlessly with the dark wood of the shelves, barely visible. My heart pounded as I reached out, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers. I had worked here for years. How had I never noticed this before? Without thinking, I pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a staircase spiraling down into darkness. I hesitated at the threshold, a chill creeping up my spine. This didn't feel right. The book, it had predicted this moment, and yet there I was, standing at the edge of the unknown, the story unfolding exactly as it had described. I stepped inside. The air grew colder as I descended the steps, the walls around me damp and echoing with every footfall. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling down into an abyss. Finally, I reached the bottom and found myself in a vast chamber, a hidden library, far older than the one above. The shelves here were massive, towering over me, filled with books that looked like they had been forgotten for centuries. My eyes darted around the room, landing on a pedestal in the center. There, bathed in a soft glow, lay the Library of Echoes, the same book I had found upstairs. But how? I had left it on the table in the back room. Slowly, I approached the pedestal, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the book once again. As my fingers brushed the leather cover, the room seemed to shift. The shelves creaked, the walls groaned, and the floor beneath me trembled. I yanked my hand back, and the book opened on its own, the pages flipping wildly before settling on a passage I hadn't read before. My heart sank as I read the words, "The librarian," trapped in the endless echo of their own curiosity, realized too late that the story had always been about them. Suddenly, the chamber darkened. The shelves seemed to close in on me, the walls tightening, the air thickening. I tried to turn back toward the stairs, but they were gone. Only the endless rows of books remained, stretching on forever in every direction. Panic gripped me as I realized the truth. The library wasn't just a place of knowledge. It was a labyrinth, a trap. And now, I was part of its story. As the darkness closed in, I heard the faintest whisper, echoing from the pages of the book. "Welcome to the Library of Echoes." I shut the book. Well, that was weird, I thought to myself after a good yawn. The kind of yawn that shuts you out from the world for a few seconds. As I was the only person in the library on a Sunday, and I had just had a filling lunch, I decided to take a nap. I made sure to look like I was reading a book, a skill I had perfected back in middle school. I remember falling asleep quickly. In the dream, I felt a sudden terror as I saw myself standing in the middle of the same library. I didn't remember getting up from my desk or walking away, yet there I was, surrounded by shelves stretching into infinity. Fear mingled with an odd compulsion, urging me forward. I wandered through the maze of bookshelves until I saw it, the small, narrow door at the end of an aisle I knew had been empty. It was just like in the book. The wood was aged, peeling paint exposing the splintering layers underneath, yet it called to me, drawing me closer. My hand reached out, grasping the cold, brass handle. Without hesitation, I pushed it open. The air beyond was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay, mixed with something I couldn't quite place, something rotten and ancient. The room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Shelves lined the room, filled with more books, each older than the last, their spines cracked and pages brittle. One book caught my eye immediately. It was thick, bound in dry, cracked leather, worn from centuries of neglect. I picked it up and instantly regretted it. As soon as I opened it, nausea overwhelmed me. The words on the page were twisted, written in some unknown language that seemed to shift and writhe before my eyes. The letters coiled like snakes, bending reality. Before I could make sense of anything, the cover grew hot, too hot. It burned like fire in my hands. I screamed and dropped it, watching in horror as my skin blistered, my hands blackening with burns. But the worst part was that it was too late. The door behind me slammed shut, the echo ringing through the room like a shot fired in an empty hall. I was trapped. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs were glued in place, held by some unseen force. A low, guttural hum began to emanate from the books surrounding me. It was so deep, it rattled my bones, reverberating through my very soul. That's when I understood. This place wasn't just a room. It was alive. The books were its organs, the shelves its skeleton, and I was the intruder. The prey dart at the room's center stood a pedestal, and on it lay another book, identical to the one I had first found. My feet moved of their own accord, pulling me toward it, as if the book were drawing me in like a magnet. The humming grew louder, the vibrations climbing higher into my chest, into my mind. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. My hands reached out, trembling, to touch the worn cover. The second my fingers brushed the leather, the humming ceased. The silence was deafening, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. With shaky hands, I opened the book. It was blank. I flipped through page after page, each one as empty as the last. My heart pounded in my ears. Then, as I reached the final page, there it was, a single sentence written in jagged, spidery handwriting. You are the last echo. A sharp pain exploded in my chest, as if something vital had just been torn from me. The room began to spin violently, the shadows closing in, pressing against me until the weight was unbearable. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like I was drowning in it. And then everything stopped. I found myself back in the main hall of the library. The hidden door, the eerie room, it was all gone, but something was wrong, very wrong. At first, it seemed like everything was normal. People moved quietly through the aisles, their arms full of books, casually browsing. But when I tried to call out to them, nothing. No sound came from my mouth. Panic set in. I ran to the nearest patron, frantically waving my hands, trying to get their attention. They didn't even flinch. And then, to my horror, they walked right through me. I staggered back, my mind spinning with disbelief. I tried again with someone else. Same result. They moved through me like I wasn't even there, like I was nothing but air. That's when it hit me. I wasn't there. I was no longer part of their world. I had become a ghost or shadow, just like the books in the library of echoes, trapped in a labyrinth of stories that no one remembered, condemned to wander the library's endless halls, a prisoner of my own curiosity. I wasn't just in the story anymore. I was the story. The last echo, lost forever in the pages of an unwritten book. As I stood there, helpless, I heard it, the humming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sounds of the library, but it grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words, "You are the last echo." A cold, sinking dread filled me. I wasn't just in the library. I was part of it now, another echo trapped in its endless, twisting halls. My story, my life, had been absorbed, just like all the others who had come before me. The library wasn't just a collection of books. It was a living thing, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too far into its depths. I tried to leave. Desperation fueled my steps as I darted from aisle to aisle, pulling open doors that led nowhere. No matter how far I ran or how many doors I opened, I always found myself back in that same room, the one with the flickering light and the shelves that stretched on forever. The books, now filled with my words, mocked me from their dusty perches. Each time I opened one, I found the same sentence waiting for me, written in jagged, spidery script, "You are the last echo." It became unbearable. I was about to read those haunting words again when, suddenly, a voice boomed out and read them for me. It was unlike any voice I had ever heard, deep and resonant, as if it was speaking from an infinitely vast space. The sound was so powerful it felt like it was tearing through my skull, vibrating through my entire body. My eardrums shattered. I felt blood gush out, warm and thick, running down my neck in a torrent. The pain was indescribable. It was as if every nerve in my body was on fire, the agony far beyond anything a human being should be able to endure. My vision blurred, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. Before I could feel the last drop of blood hit my chest, I woke up. I shot upright, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, and the oppressive darkness of the library faded into the quiet, dimly lit space around me. I was still in my chair, surrounded by piles of dusty books. A pool of drool glistened on the desk beneath my face. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the tall windows, casting soft shadows on the floor. I blinked, trying to shake off the lingering terror of the nightmare. It had felt so real, but it couldn't have been anything more than a dream, a horrifying byproduct of my overworked mind. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Only a few minutes had passed since I dozed off. I chuckled nervously, rubbing my temples as I tried to brush off the remnants of fear that clung to me. It was just a dream, I told myself, the product of spending too much time in this ancient library filled with unsettling, forgotten stories. But then I saw it. A book sat open on the desk in front of me. I didn't remember pulling it from the shelves, let alone opening it. My stomach churned as I looked closer. The pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, written in an elegant, flowing script. I scanned the list, my hands trembling as I neared the bottom of the page, and there it was, my name, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the letters for what felt like an eternity. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. My hand shot out, slamming the book shut with more force than I intended, the sound reverberating through the silent room. My laugh was hollow, forced, as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. "This is insane," I muttered, pushing the chair back as I stood, trying to convince myself that it was still part of the dream. "Fuck you, library. Fuck you." I turned toward the exit, trying to shake the feeling of unease clinging to my skin. As I walked through the aisles, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, twisting and shifting around me. The air grew colder, and the once quiet library felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. And then I heard it. "You." I stopped, my blood freezing in my veins. Ah. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the aisles, slipping into my mind like a parasite. Last. I quickened my pace, nearly running now. Echo. I burst through the main doors of the library, the cold evening air hitting me like a wave of relief. I didn't stop moving until I was several blocks away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally dared to glance back, the library loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding under the fading light. But something made me stop. Something, or someone, was watching me. I squinted, looking closer, and my heart skipped a beat. There, in the reflection of the library's tall windows, was a figure, standing right where I had been moments ago. It wasn't me. It was something else. And it was waiting. Watching. I walked away. But I knew deep down that I would never truly leave the library behind, because I wasn't just part of the story now. The story had become part of me. Growing up in Wildwood, New Jersey, means growing up with sand between your toes and the sound of waves crashing like a lullaby every night. You get used to the seasonal pulse, quiet winters with closed shops and empty streets. Then suddenly, Memorial Day hits, and the town explodes with tourists, arcade lights, and that constant smell of boardwalk fries and pizza. Life's not all beach parties and boardwalk games, though. At home, things have been tough. Dad lost his job at the shipyard last winter, and Mom's been pulling double shifts at the diner just to keep us afloat. So when I turned 16, I signed up to be a lifeguard. Not just because I heard girls dig lifeguards, but because the pay was decent and I figured I could help out. Despite being on the swim team since middle school, the training was brutal. The Atlantic isn't your friendly neighborhood pool. It's wild and unpredictable. Coach drilled us hard on rescues in rough surf, first aid until we could wrap bandages in our sleep, and the dreaded 500-meter swim against the clock. I finished every session with my muscles screaming and my lungs burning, tasting salt on my lips. Whether from sweat or the sea, I couldn't tell. Being a lifeguard has its perks. The view from the stand is unbeatable. Miles of ocean, spectacular sunrises, and a front row seat to the world waking up. The community gives respect, too. You're seen as a local hero, whether you're rescuing a lost kid or treating a jellyfish sting. Plus, local shop owners often toss free food and drinks our way, a nod to the hard work and long hours we put in on the beach. It's a small town perk that never gets old. Up in the watchtower, I lean back in the creaky wooden chair that's seen better days, my eyes scanning the horizon where the sky meets the sea. It's a slow day, the kind that falls in the lull between the fireworks of July 4th and the last hurrah of Labor Day. The beach isn't deserted, but it's not the wall-to-wall blanket mess of high season either. A few families dot the sand, kids building sandcastles and chasing waves, while a couple of older tourists brave the chilly water with tentative steps. The radio crackles occasionally, with chatter from the main station, but mostly it's just the cry of seagulls and the distant laughter of kids. I'm halfway through scanning my usual zone when I hear a voice from behind me. "Hey, Watchtower Daydreamer, you saving any lives today or just the flies?" I turn to find Torai Ellis, leaning against the doorframe with that lopsided grin that's always spelled trouble. Torai, with her sun-bleached hair always tied back in a reckless bun, and the kind of tan lines that tell stories of long summer days spent outdoors. Torai and I have run in the same circles forever, or at least since we both started doggy paddling at the YMCA. though Torai has always been one step ahead. She's just a year older than me, but it feels like more. When I was fumbling through my first awkward swim meet, she was already setting school records. By the time I caught up to join the team, she was the captain. She's always seemed just a bit out of reach, always a grade ahead and, in my mind, miles too far. Torai's face hardens, and for a moment, she looks older, more tired than someone her age should ever look. I just need to make it through this last summer. After that, I'm gone, Josh. Rutgers is my way out. I've got a plan. Just ... please. Let me handle it. Her words hang between us like the fog that sometimes rolls in off the ocean, thick and heavy, with an uneasy stillness. I want to argue, to shout that it's not fair, that she shouldn't have to handle anything. But I also know that fighting her on this won't help. Torai's stubborn, and if there's one thing I've learned about her over the years, it's that she won't budge when she's made up her mind. I sigh, rubbing my temples in frustration. Fine, but if anything happens, anything, you call me. No matter what. Promise. Torai hesitates for a second, then gives a small nod. Promise. We sit in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation pressing down on both of us. The sun is beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand. The beach has started to empty, families packing up their towels and coolers, kids whining about wanting to stay just a little longer. Torai pulls the packet of saltwater taffies out again and offers me one. I take it, unwrapping the crinkly paper and popping it into my mouth. The sweet, sticky candy feels like a brief moment of normalcy, a reminder of simpler times when the only thing we had to worry about was who could swim the fastest to the pier. I glance over at her, noticing the way her eyes stay fixed on the horizon, as if she's already somewhere else, maybe already at Rutgers, living the life she's been dreaming about. For a second, I envy her. She has a plan, an escape. Me. I'm still figuring things out, stuck here in Wildwood, where the tides might change, but everything else stays the same. You know, Torai says, breaking the silence, you're gonna be fine too. You've got the whole world ahead of you. I snort, shaking my head. Yeah, right. Lifeguarding isn't exactly a ticket to success. And I don't have a shiny Rutgers hoodie to prove it. She rolls her eyes. Josh, you've got more going for you than you realize. You just gotta start believing it. She stands up, brushing the sand off her legs. We all have our paths. Yours might just take a little longer to figure out. But trust me, you'll get there. I want to believe her, but right now, all I can think about is how much things are changing. How much I'm going to miss her when she leaves. Torai starts to walk back toward the beach, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. She pauses and turns back toward me, her expression soft but serious. I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Yeah, I manage, my throat tight. See you tomorrow. As she walks away, I watch her until she disappears into the crowd of tourists, blending in with the blur of summer's end. A part of me wants to run after her, to do something, anything, to stop her from leaving. But I know that wouldn't be fair. Torai deserves her chance to escape, to chase her future. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find mine too. The lifeguard tower feels emptier without her, the weight of the day heavy on my shoulders. I glance back out at the ocean, watching the waves roll in, relentless and untamed, just like they always have, just like they always will. For now, I guess all I can do is ride the tide and hope that, one day, I'll find my own way out of Wildwood. I pull the oars to a sudden stop, staring at the creature thrashing in the water. My mind races, trying to make sense of what we're seeing. There's no way this thing, whatever it is, belongs in the water, or anywhere for that matter. Its limbs are too long, its movements too erratic, like it's not just struggling to stay afloat, but actively fighting against the very laws of nature. Torai, I whisper, barely able to form the words. What the hell is that? She doesn't answer. Her eyes are fixed on the thing in the water, her hands clutching the edge of the boat so tightly her knuckles are white. For a moment, we're both frozen, caught in a surreal moment that feels like a nightmare we can't wake up from. Then, as if sensing our hesitation, the creature's head snaps towards us. Its eyes, empty black voids, lock onto mine, and a chill shoots down my spine, colder than the Atlantic waves splashing against my legs. Josh, we need to go. Now, Torai says, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with urgency. The thing lets out a sound, a low, guttural growl that reverberates through the air, unnatural and wrong like the ocean itself is groaning. The fin I saw earlier slices through the water again, circling closer, but now I realize it wasn't just one fin. There's more than one shark, and they're drawn to this thing. We can't just leave him, I say, though I'm not even sure it's a him anymore. Every instinct in me screams to leave, to turn the boat around and row as fast as possible. But we're lifeguards. We don't leave people behind, no matter how terrifying the situation. Torai glances at me, her face pale but determined. Josh, I don't know what that is. It's not human. I can see it now, clearer than before. The pale figure isn't just struggling, it's morphing, its limbs elongating and twisting unnaturally as if the water is shaping it, pulling it into something grotesque. Its eyes never leave mine, and there's something horribly sentient in the way it watches us. Another growl cuts through the air, this time from beneath the water. The sharks are circling tighter now, the water around the creature bubbling as if something's brewing beneath the surface. Torai, we need to pull back, I say, finally letting the words out, though my body hasn't moved. My hands are still gripping the oars, my muscles locked in fear and disbelief. Before I can even think of what to do next, the creature's arm jerks out towards us, a sharp, sudden motion that sends a spray of water across the boat. It's fast, too fast for something that should be drowning. Oh! Torai yells, snapping me out of my paralysis. She grabs the other oar, and together, we start pulling back, the boat lurching against the waves as we fight to put distance between us and the nightmare unfolding in the water. The thing lets out another growl, louder this time, almost a roar, and I see it lunge forward. For a terrifying moment, I think it's going to reach the boat, its long, pale fingers stretching toward us. But then, with a violent splash, one of the sharks strikes. The water churns as the sharks descend on the creature, drawn to its unnatural movements and the blood already in the water. Torai and I row faster, the boat rocking violently as we put as much distance as we can between us and the chaos behind us. My heart is pounding so loudly in my chest I can barely hear anything else. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, we reach the shore. The boat scrapes against the sand, and we leap out, pulling it up onto the beach with shaky hands. I collapse onto the sand, gasping for breath, my body trembling from the adrenaline and the sheer horror of what we've just witnessed. Torai falls to her knees beside me, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. For a long moment, neither of us says anything, the only sound the distant roar of the ocean and the fading cries of the gulls overhead. What the hell was that? Torai finally whispers, her voice trembling. I shake my head, unable to find an answer. I don't know. I manage, my voice hoarse. But whatever it wasn't human. We sit there in stunned silence, the world around us suddenly feeling far too real, far too dangerous. The beach that had always been our sanctuary now feels like a place where something dark and ancient lurks just beneath the surface, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it was just the beginning. Hold on, I shout, gripping the edge of the boat as tight as I can. The wave crashed down with the force of a freight train, and the world goes underwater. For a moment, everything is a blur of cold, darkness, and disorientation. Salt water floods my mouth, stinging my eyes, and the roar of the ocean fills my ears. The boat flips violently, and I'm thrown into the water. Panic sets in as I struggle to find the surface, kicking desperately against the pull of the current. For a few terrifying seconds, I don't know which way is up, the murky water disorienting me further. But then, my hand breaks through the surface, and I gasp for air, gulping down salty breaths as I break free from the ocean's grip. Torai! I scream, whipping my head around, searching frantically for her. The overturned boat bobs nearby, and I see her, barely keeping herself above water, clinging to the side. I'm here. She sputters, coughing as she struggles to hold on to the wrecked boat. The massive wave has passed, but the ocean remains in turmoil, the swell throwing us around like rag dolls. I swim toward her, my muscles screaming with exhaustion, and reach out, grabbing her arm. Together, we cling to the side of the boat, trying to catch our breath. Are you okay? I manage to ask between gulps of air. Yeah. Barely, she pants, her eyes wide with fear. That thing. Did you see it? I saw enough, I reply grimly, trying to shake off the bone-deep terror coursing through me. We need to get back to shore. Now. The water still churns violently, but the massive creature seems to have vanished, for the moment, at least. I grab onto the edge of the boat, trying to flip it upright. It's heavy and waterlogged, but with both of us pushing, we manage to get it back upright, though it's half filled with water. We scramble into the boat, shivering from the cold and adrenaline, and immediately start bailing out water with whatever we can find. Our hands, a broken paddle, anything. The wind picks up, and the sky above grows darker, thick clouds rolling in as if the ocean is summoning a storm. The air feels charged with electricity, and I have the eerie sense that something far worse is still coming. We have to move, Torai says, her voice shaking but resolute. She grabs the oars, her hands trembling but determined as she starts rowing toward the shore. I follow suit, rowing with everything I have left. Every muscle in my body screams in protest, but I can't stop. Not now, not when we're so close to getting out of this nightmare alive. The waves are relentless, and every stroke feels like a battle against the ocean itself. But the shore, though distant, is visible now, and I cling to that one glimmer of hope. We just have to make it a little further. Keep going. I urge Torai, though my own strength is fading fast. Then, just as it seems we're finally gaining ground, a deep, resonant rumble shakes the air. It's not thunder, it's something far more unsettling, like the ocean itself is growling. My heart drops as I look back over my shoulder. There, in the distance, the massive creature begins to rise again. This time, it's even larger, its grotesque form fully emerging from the depths. Its jagged, barnacle-covered body towers over the water, a leviathan of impossible proportions. The glowing orbs that pass for its eyes fix on us, and its maw opens wide, revealing rows upon rows of teeth. Row, wow! I shout, my voice breaking as pure terror takes hold. Torai doesn't hesitate. We both row like mad, every ounce of energy we have left pouring into the oars. The boat surges forward, but I can feel the pull of the creature behind us, the water being sucked toward it as it prepares to strike. The shore is so close, just a few 100 feet more. With a deafening roar, the creature lunges. Its massive jaws slam shut just feet behind the boat, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through the water that nearly flips us again. We're propelled forward, the boat skidding over the waves like a skipping stone. I don't look back. I can't. All I can focus on is the shore, the sandy beach that seems like a world away even though it's right in front of us. Just as it feels like we're about to be swallowed whole, the boat scrapes against the sand. Torai and I leap out, stumbling and collapsing onto the beach, gasping for breath, drenched and shaking with exhaustion. We scramble further up the shore, away from the water's edge, not daring to look back at the ocean. But even from here, we can feel the presence of the creature, watching us from beneath the surface. For a long moment, we just lie there, staring up at the stormy sky, the sound of the waves crashing behind us. Torai is the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. What was that? I don't have an answer. There are no words for what we just experienced. But as I sit up, looking out at the horizon, one thing is clear. The ocean holds more than just sharks and waves. There's something ancient, something monstrous lurking beneath the surface, and we've just caught a glimpse of it. But the ocean remains serene, as if the horrors we faced never existed at all. It feels surreal, watching life carry on as if nothing happened. The family's laughing, the kids splashing in the waves. It's all so normal. But I can't shake the feeling that the world isn't the same. Not for me. Not for Torai. I glance down at my hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and the ghostly sensation of that cold, dark water. It's hard to believe we survived. That thing, whatever it was, lurked beneath the waves, and we faced it head-on. Now it feels like it's watching, waiting, even though logic tells me otherwise. I sit there for what feels like hours, just watching. The sea has a way of hypnotizing you, pulling you into its rhythm, until the world narrows to the sound of waves lapping at the shore. I think about everything that's happened in the last few days, the creature, the panic, the way Torai and I just clicked in the midst of it all. I replay our escape over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out if it was real. A seagull screeches above, and it pulls me back to the present. The wind picks up, rustling the tall grass on the dunes. It's peaceful here, but it won't last forever. The creature, whatever it was, is still out there. Maybe not today, but someday it'll rise again. Maybe in a different place, maybe under different circumstances. But it will return. I pull out my phone and open my messages. There's already a new text from Torai. Made it halfway. You okay? I smile and quickly type back. Yeah, just thinking. You. A few seconds later, my phone buzzes again. Same. Don't think I'll ever look at the ocean the same way again. I sigh, feeling the same way. The sea, once a place of comfort and adventure, has now become something darker. Something that hides too many secrets. The sound of footsteps crunching in the sand breaks my thoughts. I look over my shoulder to see a park ranger approaching. His wide-brimmed hat casts a shadow over his face, but I can tell he's smiling politely. Hey there, he says, stopping a few feet away. You mind if I sit? I shake my head. Go ahead. He lowers himself onto the dune next to me, his gaze following mine out toward the ocean. Beautiful view, isn't it? He says, yeah, it is, I reply, but there's an edge to my voice that I can't quite hide. The ranger seems to pick up on it. He's quiet for a moment before he speaks again. You know, I've worked this beach for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things. The ocean ... it has a way of keeping its mysteries hidden. I glance at him, wondering if he knows, if anyone's told him what happened, but he just continues staring out at the water, as if lost in his own thoughts. Whatever you've seen, he continues, his voice low and calm, it's not for us to understand. Sometimes the best we can do is respect it. Nature has its own ways of reminding us how small we are. His words hang in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I nod, not trusting myself to speak. He's right, of course. Whatever that thing was, it's part of something bigger than us, something ancient and powerful that we'll never fully comprehend. The ranger stands up, dusting the sand off his pants. Take care of yourself, kid, he says with a nod. And if you ever need to talk, well, I'm usually around here somewhere. Thanks, I manage, watching him walk back down the dune and disappear into the crowd below. I sit there a little longer, watching the waves. The fear that gripped me so tightly is starting to loosen, replaced by something else. Maybe it's acceptance, or maybe it's just exhaustion. Either way, I know I can't let that fear control me. Not forever. As I stand up and brush the sand off my shorts, I take one last look at the ocean. I know that whatever happened out there will stay with me. But it won't define me. I'll move forward. Torai will move forward. And life ... well, life will keep going. Just like the waves. With a deep breath, I turn away from the sea and head back toward town. I had been a security guard for almost 20 years, but nothing could have prepared me for the strange, unsettling quiet of the old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. St. Mary's, once a bustling hub of life and healing, had been closed for over a decade. Now, its crumbling walls were overtaken by ivy, its windows long shattered, leaving empty, darkened eyes staring out at the world. Locals avoided the place like the plague, trading ghost stories and warnings about strange occurrences. But I didn't believe in ghosts. I took the job because it was quiet, the pay was decent, and I was used to being alone. The first few nights were uneventful. The only sounds that kept me company were the distant hum of the nearby highway, the occasional groan of the old building settling into the earth, and the soft rustle of leaves swaying in the wind. I made my rounds without issue, walking the long, dimly lit corridors with my flashlight, the beam cutting through thick, oppressive shadows. The hospital was like a maze room stripped bare, beds long removed, and abandoned medical equipment cloaked in dust. It was a ghost town, and that suited me just fine. But then, about a week into the job, things began to change. It started with the footsteps. I was on the 3rd floor, making my usual rounds through the surgery wing. It was always colder up there, the air thick and damp, like the building itself was still clinging to the past. As I walked down the hallway, my boots scuffed softly against the cracked tiles, and that's when I heard another set of footsteps. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe a stray animal had wandered in, or maybe it was just the echo of my own steps playing tricks on me. But the sound was too deliberate, too heavy, and too close. It was unmistakable, the rhythmic clomp of boots, just like mine, trailing behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped too. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight sweeping across the empty hallway behind me. Nothing, just the peeling wallpaper and broken tiles stretching out into the darkness. I took a deep breath, the sound harsh in the stillness, and continued walking, trying to shake the sense of unease that was creeping over me. But after just a few steps, the footsteps resumed, this time closer to close. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing back to me in the hollow corridor. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps stopped again. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. But there was no one there, nothing but shadows. A cold sweat broke out on my skin, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I had been working security for nearly 2 decades, and I wasn't about to let some old building get the better of me. Steeling myself, I pressed forward, my pace a little faster now, my eyes darting around as I moved. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of those footsteps lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the old pipes were acting up, or the wind had stirred something loose. But no matter how much I tried to explain it away, the truth gnawed at me. Something had been there. The following night, I returned to work, determined not to let my nerves get the best of me. But the moment I stepped into the building, I felt a presence. It was as if the hospital had woken up, its silent, crumbling halls now watching, waiting. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made my rounds as usual, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness, but the silence was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching from the shadows around midnight. As I was passing through the maternity ward, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were distant, faint, as if they were coming from deep within the building. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint their location. Then, a sound that chilled me to the bone. The soft, unmistakable cry of a baby. It was impossible. This place had been abandoned for years. There were no patients, no staff, no one. But the sound was real, clear as day, echoing through the empty halls. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run. But something morbid, curiosity, maybe, kept me rooted in place. The crying grew louder, more desperate. It was coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. My legs felt like lead as I slowly made my way toward the sound, each step feeling like a march toward something I couldn't quite understand. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The crying had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The room was empty, but on the far wall, scratched into the peeling paint, were words faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I staggered back, my pulse pounding in my ears. Panic set in, and I bolted from the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I couldn't explain what I had just experienced. I didn't believe in ghosts, but there was no denying that someone was still inside that hospital, watching, waiting. I never went back after that night. I handed in my resignation the next morning, and I haven't set foot near St. Mary's since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows creep a little too close, I can still hear those footsteps, and I wonder if they ever stopped. I finished my rounds that night without further incident, but the footsteps stayed with me, creeping into my thoughts like a bad dream. Each step had felt so deliberate, too real to ignore. Yet, despite how unsettling it was, I tried to brush it off. Old buildings made strange noises. I'd dealt with worse in my career, or so I thought. The next night, everything escalated. I was patrolling the second floor, nearing the old maternity ward, when something immediately caught my attention. One of the doors, which I knew for certain had been shut and locked, was now slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat as I frowned and shone my flashlight into the room. The weak beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior vacant, dusty room, with a cracked window and layers of peeling paint hanging from the walls. But then, as I stepped inside to get a better look, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the thick layer of dust covering the floor, were footprints. Fresh ones. The footprints led from the door I had just entered, tracing a path through the middle of the room. But what was most unnerving was that the trail stopped abruptly in front of the far wall. The prints didn't turn around, and there was no sign of anyone leaving the room. It was as if the person who made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, trying to make sense of it. I had been alone in this building for hours. There was no way anyone could have come inside without me hearing. Gripped by a rising sense of dread, I backed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I double-checked every floor that night, locking doors, securing windows, yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The disturbances only grew worse over the next few nights. Locked doors were found wide open when I returned. Items I was sure had been left untouched had been moved. And then there were the footsteps, those relentless footsteps that followed me wherever I went, their presence always close behind. They would stop when I stopped, only to start again the moment I moved. One night, I was walking down the hallway on the first floor when I noticed a wheelchair sitting in the middle of the corridor. That wasn't odd, given the nature of the hospital. But what made my blood run cold was that the wheels were still spinning, as if someone had just pushed it. Another night, I saw a faint light spilling out from underneath one of the doors on the second floor. I approached cautiously, confused because I knew the power had been shut off to the building years ago. When I opened the door, the light was gone. There was no flicker, no source, just an empty room, bathed in darkness. It was around that time that the lack of sleep started to get to me. I'd wake up at home, drenched in sweat, the sound of footsteps echoing through my mind even in the safety of my own bed. I became jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder during my rounds. The isolation was weighing on me, wearing me down. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just isolation. The hospital didn't want me there. One night, I was making my rounds as usual when I heard a loud slam behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam frantically dancing across the walls, trying to locate the source of the noise. That's when I saw someone standing at the end of the hallway. It was dark, but I could make out the silhouette of a tall, thin figure. They stood perfectly still, just watching me. I couldn't see their face, only the unsettling outline of a person, framed in the dim light of the broken windows. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. No response. I raised my flashlight, aiming it directly at the figure. As the beam cut through the darkness, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was gone. There was no one standing in the hallway. Nothing but the empty, decaying walls staring back at me. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I backed away, my mind racing, heart slamming against my ribcage. I didn't care about finishing my rounds. I returned to my station, locked the door, and sat with my back pressed against the wall, staring at the entrance. That night, the footsteps didn't follow me, but they were still there, just out of reach. I could hear them faintly, somewhere in the depths of the hospital, always pacing, always watching. I didn't return to St. Mary's after that. The next morning, I handed in my resignation without a second thought, leaving the keys on the desk without a word of explanation. Whatever haunted that place, whatever lingered in those decaying halls, was better left undisturbed to this day. I refuse to talk about those nights in the old hospital, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear the footsteps, faint, persistent, and no matter how far I run, they always seem to find me